There is a night in the old accounts that almost none of the standard histories will touch, and it does not appear in the school curriculum for reasons that will become obvious before this recording is over. The city was Shuruppak, on the flat land between the two rivers, in the last generation before the Great Water. The man in the reed hut had a name the later scribes would soften into something easier to say. The tablets remember him as Ziusudra, life of long days, the one who was told what nobody else in his generation was told. And what he was told, according to the same tablets that were pulled out of the ash and rubble of the Assyrian capital more than 150 years ago, and are now sitting under glass in the British Museum and in the Yale Collection and in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, was not one message. It was several. And several of those messages were not about the flood at all. They were about what would come after the flood. They were about what would return. Because in the accounting of the older civilization, the flood was not the end. It was a reset. It was a scheduled interruption, and on the other side of it the schedule kept running. The beings who arranged the reset had gone up. They had gotten into their sky vessels, and they had watched the water do its work from a safe altitude. And when the water went back and the mud dried and the small handful of survivors began to walk out onto a landscape that no longer resembled the one they had grown up in, those beings came back down. They came back down and they walked around and they gave instructions. And they left. But they did not leave forever. They left with a calendar, and the calendar is still running. And according to the reed wall transmission that Ziusudra received before the water rose, the calendar is close to another return point right now. That is what these next 3 hours are about. Not the flood, which most of you already know. Not the creation of the human being in the mud pit at the House of the Deep, which some of you know. This recording is about the 12 warnings that Enki, the same being who saved Ziusudra from the water, gave that same man about what happens when his sky brothers come back. And they are not gentle warnings. They are not decorative. They are operational instructions. They are the shape of what to expect when a species that considers itself the elder party to a legal agreement pulls into orbital range again and starts to check whether the terms have been kept, whether the ground crew, meaning us, has done what it was supposed to do or has broken faith with the agreement. And the reason these warnings are not in the school books, and not in most of the church readings, and not in most of the standard translations of the flood story, is that they were transmitted last, in the final portion of the reed wall session, when Ziusudra was already exhausted, and they were sealed inside the same pitch-coated jar that was buried under the mud floor of the hut before he loaded his family and the animals into the vessel and pushed off. That jar, according to the readings of certain cuneiform scholars who have been quiet about it in the peer-reviewed literature but not quiet in the private correspondence, was recovered. Recovered in fragments, translated in pieces, and stitched back together across at least 3 museum collections. The 12 warnings are in there. And what follows is the reconstruction, warning by warning, in order, because the order is part of the message, and because the last one, the 12th one, does not make sense unless you have heard the first 11. Quick pause, this is new. For the first time since the 12 codes, there is a second document. It is called the 7 Resets, every time the world was erased, matched against the sediment record, and the checklist of signs for the 8th, 4 already active. Linked below, QR code on screen. That is all. Back to the video. Now, before we get into the first warning, a small clarification about the source material, because the credibility of everything that follows depends on it. Enki, in the older Sumerian accounts, is not a symbolic figure. He is not a myth in the modern sense of the word. He is one of the named leaders of a specific expedition, arriving on this planet from a place the scribes called Nibiru, meaning crossing place, referring to the fact that this world of theirs had an orbit that crossed the plane of our familiar planets. Enki, according to Atrahasis and the Enuma Elish and the fragments now called the Lost Book of Enki, as reconstructed by certain 20th century scholars, whose work is controversial but internally consistent, was the chief scientist of that expedition. He was the being who designed the human labor form. He was the being who broke with his half-brother Enlil, the field commander, over how to treat that labor form once it started to develop language and memory and self-recognition. And he was the being who, when the council up above decided to let the water come and cleanse the surface, refused to accept the extinction of the small line of survivors he had personally shepherded. The reed wall was his loophole. He could not tell Ziusudra directly. He could tell a wall. If a man happened to be sitting on the other side of the wall, that was not his fault. That was the man's fault for listening. And so what Ziusudra heard, in that final long night at Shuruppak, was not only the boat instructions and the passenger list and the pitch specifications and the coordinates for landing after the water went down. It was also the 12 warnings. Because Enki, according to the reconstruction, knew something the rest of the council did not know or did not care about. He knew that the flood was not going to erase the memory of the people below. He knew that a small line was going to carry through. And he knew that the same Nibiru orbit that had brought his expedition here in the first place, that same 3,600-year passage, was going to bring the returning parties back. Not once, not twice, repeatedly, on a schedule. And if the small line that survived did not have the operating manual for what to do when the sky opened and the vessels came down, that line was going to be swept up into something it did not understand and could not consent to. So he transmitted the manual. And the manual is what we are about to walk through, warning by warning, from the first to the final. The first warning is about the nature of the returning parties themselves, because if you get this one wrong, every subsequent warning also becomes meaningless. According to the Readwall transmission, the beings who are going to come back are not gods. They are not divinities. They are not spiritual entities. They are not the source of the universe. And they did not create existence. And they are not entitled to worship. They are, in the plain language that Enki used to Ziusudra, a species. An older species than the small line of survivors, granted, and a species with a longer lifespan, and a species with sky vessels and metallurgy and weaponry that will look like magic to anybody who has not seen it before. But a species nonetheless. Biological, mortal on a longer scale, but mortal. Political, divided against itself, prone to error, prone to argument, prone to the same categories of failure that any organized civilization is prone to, only bigger. Because they have more power to break more things when they get it wrong. And the reason this warning comes first, according to the fragment, is that the returning parties are aware of the mistake that was made the first time around. The first time they arrived, in the founding expedition, the local inhabitants of this world had never seen anything like them, and the response was straightforward. The response was to fall on the ground. The response was to build them houses and call those houses temples. The response was to bring them food and call that food offering. The response was to accept every instruction they gave without question and to encode those instructions into ritual and to pass them down from generation to generation as sacred law. That was, according to Enki, a natural response from beings who had no other framework for what they were seeing. But it was also an exploitable response, and it was exploited, not by all of the arriving parties, not by Enki himself, who according to his own testimony was uncomfortable with it, but by a large enough faction of the expedition that a pattern was set. The pattern was that the visitors were divine, the locals were subordinate, and the arrangement was permanent. Anything that violated the arrangement was heresy. Anybody who questioned the arrangement was to be corrected. And the correction, in several documented instances that survive in the tablet record, was severe. So the first warning, in the operational language of the Readwall session, is this. When the vessels come down again, and they will come down again, according to the schedule that was set at the last departure, do not fall on the ground. Do not build them houses. Do not bring them food and call it offering. Do not accept their instructions as sacred law simply because they are the ones giving the instructions. They are a species. Older, larger, technologically ahead, but a species. They can be reasoned with. They can be negotiated with. They can be refused, in specific narrow cases where refusal is warranted. And most importantly, they can be observed. Because observation, according to Enki, is the one thing they did not expect the small line to develop. They expected worship. They expected memory. They expected obedience. What they did not expect was that the descendants of the labor form they had designed would grow up into observers, would grow up into a species that watched them the way they had watched the older hominid population before deciding what to do with it. And the ability to observe the returning parties, without falling into fear and without falling into worship and without falling into the easy category of treating them as gods, is the first prerequisite for surviving what comes after. There is a specific line in the reconstructed fragment that carries this warning most sharply. Enki tells Ziusudra, according to the translation, that his sky brothers will look impressive. They will look impressive in the way that any advanced technology looks impressive to a party that has not encountered that technology before. Their vessels will make sounds that have no natural analog. Their bodies will be taller, and their skin will look different, and their eyes will hold a color that is not common in the local population. Their weapons, if they choose to display their weapons, will do things that no local weapon can do. Their communication, which will not always be verbal, will feel like it is coming from inside the observer's own head. All of this will produce the sensation of encountering something that is beyond category, something that is beyond ordinary experience, something that must be, in the intuitive framing of the observer, of a higher order. But higher, in the sense that Enki used the word, does not mean divine. It means further along on the same developmental line. It means older, more technologically evolved, more organized. It does not mean of a different kind of substance. It does not mean incapable of error. It does not mean entitled to the position of the sacred. And in fact, according to the same fragment, several of the leaders of the founding expedition had already come to regret the way the earlier interaction had gone. They had seen the pattern of temple building and offering and priesthood take hold in the surface populations, and they had seen how quickly that pattern hardened into something the returning parties would have to either honor or break. If they honored it, they were locked into a role of divinity they did not actually occupy. If they broke it, they would produce disillusionment and rebellion in populations that had structured their entire cultures around the earlier arrangement. Enki, according to the reconstruction, considered both outcomes bad, and he considered the responsibility for both outcomes to rest partly on the founding expedition itself for not having been clearer about what it was and was not. The warning, then, is not only about how to receive the returning parties, it is also about how to have prepared oneself before their arrival so that the reception happens in the right register. And the preparation, according to the reconstructed instructions, has three components. The first component is memory. The small line must remember, generation after generation, that the arriving parties are a species, not gods. This memory must be encoded in the stories and passed down and defended against corruption, because there will be pressure, both from inside the small line and from outside actors, to soften this memory back into divinity, because divinity is easier to organize a society around than species. Divinity fits in a temple. Species has to sit at a table. The second component is language. The small line must have a language that is capable of describing the arriving parties in accurate operational terms. If the only words the small line has available for describing tall, bright beings from the sky are the words God and angel and heavenly host and divine emissary, then the small line will inevitably slot the arriving parties into those words, and the words will do the thinking for the observer. Enki, according to the fragment, insisted that Ziusudra memorize a specific set of alternative descriptive terms: species from Nibiru, council member, field commander, chief scientist, expedition officer, ground crew, terms that name the function without inflating the ontology. Because as long as those terms are available, the observer has somewhere to put the observation that is not the temple. The third component of the preparation, according to the reed wall reconstruction, is discernment. The small line must be able to tell the difference between the returning parties themselves, who are one specific species from one specific origin with one specific history, and everything else that might come along in the same broad period of contact. Because the returning parties will not be the only category of visitor. There are, according to Enki, at least two other categories of contact that the small line will have to navigate in the same historical window, and confusing those categories with the returning parties will produce catastrophic errors, which we will come to in the third warning on recognition protocols. For now, the point is only that discernment is a skill, and skills have to be practiced, and the practice has to happen before the moment when it is needed, not after. So the first warning, taken as a whole, is a warning against a specific human reflex. The reflex to fall down, the reflex to declare that whatever is more powerful than oneself is holy, the reflex to give away agency at the first sign of overwhelming novelty. Enki, according to the transmission, considered this reflex the single greatest vulnerability of the population he had designed. He had built the recognition capacity into the human labor form intentionally so that his creation could tell where it was and what was happening to it. But recognition, without the discipline of holding it steady in the face of intimidation, collapses back into worship. And worship, in the specific historical context of a returning species with a schedule, is the beginning of every subsequent mistake in the sequence. That is why this warning comes first, because if the small line falls down at the first sight of the descending vessels, none of the next 11 warnings will get a chance to be applied. The rest of the sequence assumes an observer who is still standing, watching, and remembering that the beings on the ramp are a species, not gods. There is one further note in the fragment on this first warning that is worth mentioning, because it addresses the question of how the small line should respond emotionally to the arrival. Enki, according to the reconstruction, did not tell Ziusudra to be cold. He did not tell him to feel nothing. He acknowledged that the arrival of the sky vessels would produce, in any reasonable observer, a strong emotional response. Wonder, fear, a sense of the ground shifting under the categories of ordinary life. These responses, according to Enki, are appropriate. They are not the problem. The problem is not the feeling. The problem is what the feeling gets translated into. If the feeling gets translated into worship, the small line has already lost the encounter. If the feeling gets translated into observation, into careful noticing, into the recording of what is actually happening, then the feeling has done its work. It has woken the observer up. It has sharpened the attention. It has made memory possible. And memory, from the beginning of this transmission to the end of it, is what Enki was trying to preserve. Because a small line with intact memory has options. A small line without memory has none. The second warning, in the ordering that Ziusudra received through the reed wall, is about the timing and the signature of the return. Because the returning parties are not going to appear randomly. They are not going to appear in a way that catches the small line completely off guard. According to the transmission, and according to the tablet fragments that survive in the Nineveh collection and were reassembled by scholars working across the mid-19th and early 20th centuries, the arrival is governed by a specific orbital schedule that has been running for as long as the parent world of the arriving parties has been in its current orbit. That world, called Nibiru in the Sumerian records, has an orbital period of 3,600 years. Not 3,500, not 4,000, 3,600, measured in the local rotations of this planet around its own sun. That period, called a sar in the older accounting, is the fundamental unit of the returning schedule. Every sar, the parent world of the arriving parties, makes its closest approach to this region of the solar arrangement, and every sar, that approach is a decision point. It is a moment when the leadership of the arriving parties considers whether to send a vessel down, and if they send one, what its mission is. Sometimes, according to the fragments, no vessel is sent. The approach happens and passes, and the parent world recedes back into the outer dark, and there is no visit. This has happened at least twice in the reconstructed timeline, at points when the internal politics of the arriving parties made a visit inconvenient, or when the surface conditions of this planet made a visit unlikely to yield useful information. But those non-arrivals are the exception. In the majority of SAR approaches, some form of vessel is sent, and some form of assessment is conducted, and some form of contact is either attempted or deliberately avoided. And the pattern of that contact, the signature of it, is what the second warning is about. Because Enki, according to the Reedwall transmission, wanted Ziusudra to be able to recognize the signature, to know when he saw it, that what he was seeing was in fact the scheduled return and not something else, and to know what phase of the schedule the return corresponded to. The signature has several parts. The first part is astronomical. In the period before a SAR approach, the parent world becomes visible to the naked eye of a careful observer. It appears low on the horizon, in the general vicinity of the ecliptic path, at first as a reddish-brown point of light that is easy to mistake for a slow-moving planet in an unusual position. Over the course of years, sometimes decades, that point of light grows brighter and moves against the background of the fixed stars in a way that is not consistent with the movement of any of the familiar planets. The old astronomers, according to the tablet record, learned to track this appearance and to distinguish it from the movements of Mars and Jupiter and Saturn, which they also tracked. The Sumerian and Akkadian sky watchers had a specific term for the returning body when it first appeared in the observational window. They called it the crossing star, and its appearance was considered the first sign that the SAR was closing. The second part of the signature is atmospheric. As the parent world of the arriving parties approaches its closest point, its passage through the outer regions of the solar arrangement produces effects that can be observed from the surface of this planet. Certain electromagnetic disturbances become more common. The behavior of the upper atmosphere shifts in ways that produce unusual displays in the polar regions, extending sometimes into latitudes where such displays are not normally seen. The magnetic field of this planet experiences fluctuations that can be detected by careful observers using even relatively primitive instruments, and that in modern conditions can be detected with high precision by any standard magnetometer. The tablet fragments describe these effects in language that maps, according to the modern reconstructions, onto phenomena that space physicists would now recognize as consistent with the passage of a massive body through the heliospheric boundary. Whether or not one accepts the underlying Nibiru hypothesis, the descriptive language in the tablets is specific and internally consistent, and it points to observable phenomena that a modern instrumented civilization would be capable of detecting. The third part of the signature is biological and geological. As the parent world approaches, according to the reed wall reconstruction, there are effects on the biosphere of this planet that a careful observer will notice. Animal behavior becomes unusual in patterns that resemble but do not exactly match the patterns observed before major seismic events. Migratory species deviate from their normal routes. Species that are sensitive to magnetic navigation become disoriented. Underground water tables shift, sometimes producing new springs in places where no springs existed before, and sometimes drying up springs that have been reliable for generations. The tectonic activity of the planet increases, particularly along the seams where the crustal plates meet, and produces earthquakes and volcanic events at frequencies above the long-term baseline. None of these effects, on their own, are proof of anything, but taken together, in a specific pattern that includes the astronomical signature and the atmospheric signature and the biological and geological signature all happening in the same period, they constitute what Enki called the reading. The reading is the composite signal that tells the small line that the SAR is closing and that the arrival window is opening. The reading, according to the reconstruction, does not happen all at once. It happens over a period that can extend across several human generations, because the parent world of the arriving parties is on a slow orbit, and its influence on this region grows and recedes over long periods. The first signs, the earliest astronomical indicators, appear roughly 2 to 3 centuries before the closest approach. The atmospheric and magnetic signatures become detectable roughly 1 century before. The biological and geological effects intensify in the final decades, and the actual arrival, the descent of vessels, and the establishment of surface presence happens in a window that can range from a few years to a few decades on either side of the closest approach. So the reading is not a single event, it is a sequence. And Enki, according to the transmission, wanted Ziusudra to understand the sequence so that the small line would not be surprised. There is, however, an additional element in the second warning that goes beyond simple pattern recognition. Enki, according to the fragment, told Ziusudra that the arriving parties themselves would also be doing a reading. They would be watching the same signature from their side. They would be tracking their own approach to this planet, and they would be planning their vessel dispatch accordingly. And they would also be watching the surface, watching for signs of civilization, watching for signs of continuity from the previous SAR, watching for evidence that the ground crew, meaning the human population, had maintained the arrangements that were set at the previous departure, or watching for evidence that those arrangements had broken down. Because a SAR approach where the surface shows continuity is a different kind of visit than a SAR approach where the surface shows collapse or fragmentation or the loss of the operating instructions. If the surface shows continuity, according to the reconstruction, the arriving parties will send what Enki called a review mission. A vessel, or a small group of vessels, containing council members and technical staff, whose purpose is to assess the state of the arrangements and to make adjustments where needed. Review missions tend to be relatively benign because they assume the ground crew is functioning and only needs to be updated on new instructions. If the surface shows fragmentation, according to the reconstruction, the arriving parties will send what Enki called a restoration mission, a larger vessel deployment containing more personnel and more equipment whose purpose is to identify what has gone wrong with the ground crew and to attempt to repair it. Restoration missions are more invasive. They involve direct contact with surface populations. They involve the reactivation of certain sites and the reissuing of certain instructions. And they involve the identification and correction of surface leadership that has moved away from the original arrangement. If the surface shows collapse, meaning the ground crew has failed entirely, or has been eliminated by natural catastrophe or war or other cause, the arriving parties will send what Enki called a reset mission. A reset mission is the most severe of the three. It involves the direct intervention of the sky forces in the affairs of the surface, and in the previous instance, according to the reconstruction, it involved the flood itself. The flood was a reset. The parent world had approached, and the reading had shown that the ground crew had drifted so far from its original purpose that a reset was chosen as the response. That was 3,600 years, then another 3,600, then several more SARs ago. And the returning parties on the current approach, according to Enki's transmission, will be reading the surface again to determine which mission profile is appropriate. This is why the second warning is not only about recognizing the return, it is also about understanding what the return will look like when it comes. Because the shape of the arrival, the kind of vessel that comes down and the kind of personnel that steps out of it, will tell the small line what the arriving parties have already decided about the state of the surface. If a review mission arrives, the small line has one set of responses available to it. If a restoration mission arrives, the small line has a different set of responses. If a reset mission arrives, the small line's options are limited, and its priorities become different. Enki wanted Ziushudra to understand the difference, because Ziushudra was being appointed the origin point of the next small line, and the next small line would need to teach its own descendants how to read the signature and how to interpret the mission profile. And there is one final layer to the second warning that the fragment insists must be included. The current Sar, according to the transmission that Enki gave to Ziusudra, and according to the reconstruction of the schedule since then, is one that Enki considered particularly critical. Not because he knew exactly when it would fall in the calendar of the surface population. He did not have that precision. But because he knew that after a certain number of Sar cycles had passed, the arrangement would enter what he called a closing phase. The closing phase is not the end of the arrangement. It is the beginning of the end. It is the period during which the returning parties will start making decisions about what to do with the arrangement as a whole, whether to continue it, whether to modify it, whether to conclude it. And the closing phase, according to Enki, is where the small line will most need to have retained the warnings. Because in the closing phase, the choices that are made by the surface and the choices that are made by the returning parties will set the terms for whatever comes after. Whatever comes after this whole long story of contact and creation and flood and return again, Enki did not say when the closing phase would begin, but he said that the small line would know it when it came, because the reading would be strong, and the arrivals would be frequent, and the questions would begin to be asked in earnest. The third warning, in the sequence that Ziusudra received, is on the subject of recognition, and it is one of the more technical warnings in the set, because it presupposes that the small line has already grasped the first two warnings and is now ready to distinguish between different categories of visitor. Because the arriving parties, according to Enki, are not going to be the only category of contact that the small line encounters in the period around the return. There will be others, and confusing those others with the returning parties themselves, or confusing the returning parties with those others, will produce the wrong response at the wrong time, and the wrong response at that particular moment in the schedule cannot be easily corrected afterward. So Enki, according to the reed wall reconstruction, walked Ziusudra through a taxonomy of contact categories. The first category is the returning parties themselves, the species from Nibiru, the council members and their support staff, and the technical crews that operate the sky vessels. Those parties, when they arrive, will arrive with a specific signature that includes not only the astronomical and atmospheric signs already described in the second warning, but also a specific set of behaviors. They will announce themselves. They will identify themselves by lineage, giving the names of the council members they represent. They will refer to specific locations on the surface, sites that were established during the founding expedition or during earlier return visits, and they will expect the local population to know those sites even if the local population has forgotten the meaning of them. They will speak in a formal register that reflects a legal relationship. They will ask questions that are meant to establish continuity with the previous visits. And they will produce documents, either physical or transmitted, that carry the seals of the ruling council. That is the first category, and it is the category the warnings as a whole are addressed to. But there are others. The second category is what Enki called the surface staff. These are members of the founding expedition, or their descendants, or their designated agents, who never left with the main body of the expedition, and who have remained on the surface across all the intervening SARs. Their numbers are small. Their locations are dispersed. Their function, according to the reconstruction, is to serve as a permanent maintenance presence for certain installations that the founding expedition set up and never fully deactivated. They know the codes and the protocols. They can operate certain machinery. They can gain entry to certain sites that are locked to the general surface population. And they are, in a certain sense, the ground crew that has actually kept the arrangement running during the long intervals between visits. But they are not the arriving parties. They are a separate class. And when the arriving parties come down, the surface staff will make contact with them and confirm their identities and hand over their operational logs. The small line should be aware that this class exists, and should not confuse the surface staff with either the arriving parties or with ordinary members of the local human population. The third category, according to the reed wall fragment, is more difficult. This is the category that Enki called the ones who broke faith. These are members of the earlier expeditions, or of related expeditions, who at some point in the long history of contact chose to remain on the surface without authorization and without the formal role of the surface staff. Some of them broke with the main body over political disputes. Some of them broke over doctrinal disputes. Some of them broke over what to do with the human population and how to conduct relations with it. And some of them, according to the fragment, broke because they had entered into personal relationships with individuals from the local population that the main body of the expedition considered improper. The result of these breakings was a scattered group of beings who were technically of the same species as the arriving parties, but who no longer had standing in the ruling council and no longer represented its authority. They developed their own communities. They developed their own instructions to the surface populations they influenced. They developed, in some cases, their own religious systems, their own priesthoods, their own centers of power. And when the arriving parties come down again, according to the transmission, one of the tasks of the returning mission will be to identify these broken parties and to determine what to do with them. The small line should be aware that they exist and should be careful about which teachings and which sites and which lineages ultimately trace back to which category. Because a teaching that comes from a broken party is not the same as a teaching that comes from the ruling council. And a site that was built by the broken parties is not the same as a site that was built by the founding expedition. The visible remains may look similar. The underlying provenance is entirely different. The fourth category, and this is where the taxonomy becomes controversial in the modern reconstruction of the transmission, is what Enki called the beings on adjacent frequencies. These are not members of the arriving party species. They are not surface staff. They are not broken members of related expeditions. They are, according to the fragment, an entirely separate class of beings that exists on what the transmission called adjacent frequencies of the same reality. What this means in the operational language of the tablets is unclear, and it has been the subject of debate among the scholars who have reconstructed the passage. Some readings interpret adjacent frequencies as referring to beings from parallel physical worlds, whether other planets in other systems or other regions of this world that are not accessible to ordinary sensory apparatus. Other readings interpret it as referring to beings that occupy the same physical space as the surface population, but that operate on a different bandwidth of experience, perceivable only under certain conditions of consciousness or with certain instruments that the surface population has not yet developed. The distinction between these two readings is not resolvable from the tablet fragments alone. What is clear is that Enki considered this category real, considered it distinct from the returning parties, and considered it something the small line would have to learn to distinguish from the returning parties when the returning parties actually arrived. The reason the distinction matters, according to the reconstruction, is that the beings on adjacent frequencies have their own interests in the surface population, and those interests are not necessarily aligned with the interests of the ruling council. Some of the beings on adjacent frequencies are, in the language of the transmission, opportunistic. They watch the arrivals and the departures of the returning parties. They watch the changes in the surface population, and they attempt, at various moments, to insert themselves into the process. They present themselves to certain individuals in the surface population, in visions or dreams or waking encounters, and they give teachings that resemble the teachings of the arriving parties, but that carry different underlying instructions. Their goal, according to the fragment, is to acquire influence over the surface population without having to go through the formal process that the ruling council uses. And because they are not physical in the same sense that the arriving parties are physical, they are harder to detect and harder to dismiss and harder to challenge. The small line, according to Enki, must be able to recognize the difference between a teaching that comes from the ruling council and a teaching that comes from the beings on adjacent frequencies, because the two categories will sometimes look similar on the surface, but will lead to very different outcomes if followed. The tools for recognition, according to the Readwall transmission, are several. The first tool is provenance. Any teaching, any instruction, any claim of contact must be traceable back through a chain of transmission that can be verified against the tablet record. If the teaching cannot be traced, or if the chain of transmission is broken or dubious, the teaching should be held at arm's length until further verification is possible. The arriving parties, when they come down, will bring their own provenance with them. They will refer to specific historical events, to specific council members, to specific instructions given in earlier visits. If the being making the claim cannot produce that provenance, or produces a version of it that does not match the tablet record, the claim is suspect. The second tool is coherence. Any teaching that comes from the arriving parties, or that legitimately represents their intentions, will be internally coherent. It will be consistent with the other teachings from the same source, It will not contradict the fundamental instructions that were given at earlier visits. Teachings that come from the broken parties or from the beings on adjacent frequencies will often be internally inconsistent or will contradict the tablet record in specific ways that betray their origin. The small line, according to the reconstruction, must have a working knowledge of the tablet record in order to perform this coherence check. Without that working knowledge, the check is impossible, and the small line becomes vulnerable to any teaching that presents itself with sufficient force. The third tool is what Enki called the signature of intent. Any being making contact, whether physical or otherwise, has an intent behind the contact. The arriving parties intend to conduct the review, restoration, or reset mission as their leadership has determined. Their intent is functional. It is oriented toward the completion of a specific task within a specific schedule. The broken parties intend to consolidate whatever position they have managed to build in the surface population, and their intent is preservational. The beings on adjacent frequencies intend to gain influence they have not been formally granted, and their intent is acquisitive. Each of these intents leaves a signature. The signature is detectable in the pattern of the teaching, in the demands it makes of the recipient, in the sacrifices it asks the recipient to make, and in the promises it holds out in return. A being that promises immediate power in exchange for specific ritual actions is showing the signature of an adjacent frequency contact. A being that speaks in the register of legal continuity and refers to prior arrangements is showing the signature of a returning party. A being that mixes both, or that alternates between them, is showing the signature of a broken party trying to appear legitimate. The third warning, taken as a whole, is a warning against confusion. Against letting the excitement of the moment collapse the distinctions that the transmission worked so hard to establish. Because when the vessels come down and the sky is full of activity and the surface population is in various states of panic and elation, it will be difficult to hold the distinctions steady. The distinctions will want to blur, the teachings will want to run together, and the small line will be pressured from many directions at once to accept whatever contact presents itself as the legitimate contact. Enki insisted, according to the reconstruction, that the distinctions were operational. They were not academic. They were the difference between correct response and incorrect response. And correct response, in the period of the return, is not a matter of preference. It is a matter of survival. Because the wrong recognition, sustained over a period of years or generations, produces the wrong alignment. And the wrong alignment, when the arriving parties finally sit down to conclude their business with this planet, will find itself on the wrong side of the accounting. The fourth warning, in the sequence, moves from recognition to conduct. Because once the small line can identify the returning parties for what they are and can distinguish them from adjacent categories of contact, the immediate question becomes what to do, what to say, how to behave in the presence of vessels that have landed and personnel that have stepped out. The read-wall transmission, according to the reconstruction, spends significant time on this question because Enki knew that the answer was not intuitive and that the natural inclination of the small line, absent specific instruction, would produce exactly the responses he was trying to prevent. The fourth warning, in its shortest form, is this. When the arriving parties come down and begin to speak with representatives of the small line, do not swear allegiance, do not offer resources, do not sign anything, do not agree to anything, do not give away any part of the surface population's autonomy in exchange for anything the arriving parties may promise in return. And do not, under any circumstances, do these things quickly, in the first hours or days of contact, when the pressure of the moment and the intimidating scale of the vessels and the shock of the encounter will make the small line most vulnerable to being pushed into agreements that will bind it for the remainder of the SAR. The reason for this warning, according to the reconstruction, is that the arriving parties will operate on a legal framework. Their expedition, their contact with this planet, their arrangements with prior surface populations, and their internal politics all run through a formal legal apparatus that goes back to the founding of their civilization on their parent world. When they arrive and make contact, they are not making a friendly visit. They are conducting a legal action. And legal actions, in their tradition, are conducted through the formal exchange of consents and agreements and pledges of continuity. What the small line will experience as a diplomatic greeting is, on the arriving party's side, the opening of a legal proceeding. Anything the small line says, anything it agrees to, anything it gives up, will be recorded and treated as binding. Not binding in the sense of a casual promise, binding in the sense of a treaty that will remain in force for the duration of the current SAR and possibly beyond, and that the small line will not be able to modify or exit once it has been entered into. Enki, according to the fragment, was specific about this. He described to Ziusudra the way the arriving parties conduct their formal proceedings. They begin with what he called the establishment of standing. They ask questions that are meant to establish who is representing whom, what authority the representatives have, and what continuity exists between the current representatives and any prior representatives who dealt with the arriving parties in earlier visits. These questions, according to Enki, are the moment at which the small line is most likely to make its first serious error, because the natural inclination of a surface representative faced with such questioning is to overstate their authority, to claim to represent more than they actually represent, to imply continuity where the continuity is at best partial, to speak on behalf of the entire surface population when in fact they speak only for a fraction of it. All of these overstatements will be recorded, and the arriving parties will proceed on the assumption that the overstatements are accurate, which means that the eventual agreement, if one is reached, will be treated as binding on the whole surface population even if only a small fraction of it was actually represented at the negotiation. For this reason, Enki instructed Ziusudra to teach the small line that the correct opening posture when the arriving parties arrive and begin questioning is what he called the posture of listening. Do not claim standing you do not have. Do not accept the framing of the questions as the arriving parties present them. Do not enter into the formal proceeding at the pace and on the terms that the arriving parties propose. Instead, ask for time. Ask for the questions to be recorded and considered. Ask for the small line to have the opportunity to gather its own representatives and to determine what standing they actually have, and to consult the tablet record for guidance on prior arrangements. This posture will not be what the arriving parties expect. It may frustrate them. It may prompt them to escalate their language and to threaten certain consequences for the delay. But delay, according to Enki, is one of the few tools the small line has available to it in the opening phase of the return, and delay must be used because the alternative is being rushed into agreements that cannot be undone. The second component of the fourth warning is on the subject of resources. When the arriving parties arrive, they will need things. Their vessels will need certain kinds of maintenance. Their personnel will need shelter and food and water. And their mission, whatever it is, will have material requirements that they will expect the surface population to provide. This is normal, in the framework of their tradition, and the small line should expect the requests. The question is what the small line should agree to provide and on what terms. The natural inclination of a surface representative faced with a request from an arriving party is to comply as fully as possible, because the arriving parties are impressive and the request feels like a small thing to ask in the face of such impressive power. Enki warns Ziusudra against this inclination. Every request that is granted quickly and without negotiation, according to the reconstruction, will be treated by the arriving parties as an establishment of custom. It will become the baseline for what the small line is expected to provide. Subsequent requests will be larger, and the small line will find itself in a spiral of accommodation that leaves it, over time, with progressively less of its own resources and progressively less of its own autonomy. The correct response, according to the reconstruction, is to treat every request as a negotiation, not to refuse outright, because outright refusal produces confrontation that the small line is not in a position to sustain, but to accept in principle and to negotiate on the specifics, to ask what will be given in return, to ask how the accommodation will be recorded in the formal proceedings, to ask what standing the small line will gain by providing the resources requested, to make the exchange, in other words, into a proper transaction with terms on both sides, rather than into an offering that carries no reciprocity. The arriving parties, according to Enki, understand transactions. They come from a civilization that runs on transactions. What they may attempt, in the early phase of contact, is to induce the small line to make offerings instead of transactions, because offerings put the small line in the position of the supplicant, and transactions put the small line in the position of the equal party. If the small line can hold the transactional framing steady, it establishes a different relationship than the founding expedition established with the surface populations of that earlier era. The founding expedition induced offerings. The offerings became temple rituals. The temple rituals became the whole architecture of divinity that Enki was trying to warn against in the first warning. The fourth warning is the practical application of that first warning to the actual mechanics of the encounter. The third component of the fourth warning is on the subject of information. The arriving parties will want information. They will want to know what has happened on the surface during the intervening SAR. They will want to know what has been remembered and what has been forgotten. They will want to know what technologies the surface population has developed on its own. They will want to know what population it has reached, what political structures it has organized itself into, what its current major concerns are, what its capacities and its vulnerabilities are. All of this information they will collect, and all of it they will use in their assessment. The natural inclination of a surface representative faced with such questioning is to give the information fully and accurately, because concealment feels dishonest, and because the arriving parties will seem to be entitled to the information as part of their formal proceeding. Enki warned against this inclination as well. Not every piece of information the arriving parties request should be provided. Not every piece of information should be provided at the pace they request it. And no piece of information should be provided without the small line understanding what the information will be used for. The tablet fragments describe, according to the reconstruction, a specific technique that the small line should employ. When a question is asked, the representative should acknowledge the question, indicate that the answer will be provided, and then ask a clarifying question in return. What is the purpose of the information? How will it be used in the proceeding? What conclusions will be drawn from it? What alternatives are available if the information is not provided or is provided in a limited form? These clarifying questions serve two purposes. They slow the proceeding, which, as already noted, is one of the small line's few available tools, and they reveal, in the arriving parties' responses, the shape of what the arriving parties are trying to determine, which lets the small line see the outline of the proceeding as it develops and adjust its responses accordingly. The fourth warning, taken as a whole, is an instruction in negotiation posture. And negotiation posture, according to the reconstruction, is not something that can be improvised in the moment of contact. It is a discipline that has to be practiced in advance. The small line must have its representatives already identified before the arrival. Those representatives must have already studied the tablet record. They must have already worked through what the likely opening questions will be and what the correct responses are. They must have already agreed among themselves on what can be conceded and on what cannot be conceded. And they must have the discipline, when the moment comes, to hold to their prepared posture even under the pressure that the arriving parties will exert. Enki, in his transmission to Ziusudra, was aware that this preparation would be difficult across many generations. He was aware that the small line would drift, would forget, would develop factions, would have its own internal politics that made unified preparation harder over time. But he insisted that the preparation must nonetheless be attempted, because the alternative was to face the return unprepared, and the return unprepared, according to the accounting he was leaving behind, was the surest way for the small line to lose the game entirely. There is one further note in the fragment on this fourth warning that deserves attention. Enki, according to the reconstruction, told Ziusudra that the arriving parties would in some cases attempt to bypass the formal proceedings entirely by dealing with individual members of the small line rather than with the small line as a whole. They would identify individuals who could be flattered, or bribed, or intimidated, or seduced into signing agreements on behalf of the whole. These individuals, once they had signed, would then be treated by the arriving parties as legitimate representatives, and the agreements they had signed would be treated as binding. The small line must have, according to the transmission, a mechanism for identifying and neutralizing these individual bypasses. It must have a clear understanding, within itself, of who has standing and who does not. It must have a mechanism for repudiating agreements that were signed by unauthorized parties. And it must have, in general, a level of internal cohesion that makes it difficult for the arriving parties to divide the small line against itself. Because division, according to the fragment, is the arriving party's oldest and most effective negotiating tool, and the small line's ability to resist division is proportional to its ability to hold its own position through the whole long proceeding without being fragmented into individual arrangements that collectively add up to defeat. The fifth warning moves from procedure to substance, and it addresses what may be the most fundamental point of contention that will arise when the returning parties come down. Because at some point in the formal proceedings, and probably early in them, the arriving parties will make a claim. The claim is not something that will be argued at length or presented with elaborate justification. It will be stated, in the register of established fact, as the foundation on which everything else in the proceeding will rest. The claim is that the surface population, meaning every human being currently living on this planet, is the property of the arriving parties. Not property in the sense of chattel or the sense of a possession that can be moved around. Property in the sense of a derived population that was created by the arriving parties for their own purposes, using their own genetic material, and that therefore falls under their jurisdiction in the same way that any created or engineered organism falls under the jurisdiction of its designer. This claim, according to the Reed-Wall transmission, is the genetic claim. And Enki was direct with Ziusudra about it, because he knew Ziusudra would face it and he knew the small line would face it in every subsequent return. The claim, in its strongest form, will be that the human species as it exists today did not develop through the ordinary processes of biological evolution alone. It was, according to the arriving party's account, produced through a specific intervention conducted by them at a specific point in the past, using specific techniques to combine the genetic material of a pre-existing hominid population with genetic material from their own species. The result, according to their account, is the current human labor form. The labor form was designed for specific purposes, mainly to work the mining operations that the arriving parties had established on this planet to extract the materials they needed for their own atmospheric maintenance program. The labor form succeeded beyond expectations. It developed language and memory and self-awareness at rates the designers had not anticipated. It became, over time, more than a labor form. But it never ceased, in the arriving party's legal framework, to be their creation. And their creation, in that framework, remains their property. Enki, according to the reconstruction, did not deny the underlying facts of the genetic claim. He had been present at the design work. He was the chief scientist of the intervention. He knew that the account, in its factual outline, was substantially correct. What he denied was the legal conclusion the arriving parties would draw from those facts. And this distinction between the factual outline and the legal conclusion is what the fifth warning is designed to arm the small line with, because the small line is going to lose the argument about the facts. The tablet record itself, if it is examined honestly, supports the arriving party's account of the intervention. The genetic evidence, which the surface population is now capable of examining directly through its own laboratories, will also support certain elements of the account, particularly around the sudden appearance of certain sequences in the human genome that do not have obvious precursors in the ancestral hominid line. So the factual defense of the small line is weak. The small line cannot credibly deny that some kind of intervention took place. What it can dispute, and what Enki insisted it must dispute, is the legal significance of that intervention. Because the arriving parties will argue that, because they conducted the intervention, they own the result. And Enki's counter-argument, which he taught to Ziusudra and which he intended the small line to preserve across all the SARs, is that the intervention produced not just a labor form but a full person, a being with recognition capacity, a being with the ability to observe and reflect and choose, a being, in short, with the same qualities that the arriving parties themselves possess and that they consider constitutive of personhood in their own legal framework. And a full person, in their own tradition, is not property. A full person has standing. A full person can enter into agreements as an equal party. A full person cannot be owned by another person, regardless of the circumstances of their origin. This principle is fundamental to the arriving party's own civilization. It is written into their oldest legal codes. And Enki intended the small line to invoke it against the arriving parties, using their own tradition against them when the moment came. The argument runs like this. If the intervention produced a labor form only, meaning an organism with functional capacity but without recognition capacity, then the arriving party's genetic claim would be valid and the surface population would indeed be property. But the intervention did not produce a labor form only. It produced beings who observe their circumstances, remember their history, form judgments about their situation, and choose responses to it, which are the operational tests, in the arriving party's own legal tradition, for personhood. Therefore, according to their own tradition, the surface population consists of persons, not property. Therefore, according to their own tradition, the genetic claim is invalid, not because the facts of the intervention are disputed, but because the legal conclusion that they draw from those facts does not follow, given the actual capacities of the beings the intervention produced. This is the counter-argument. It rests entirely on the small line being able to demonstrate, in the moment of the proceeding, that it possesses the qualities that the arriving party's own tradition uses to define personhood, which means the small line must arrive at the proceeding as observers, not as supplicants, as beings capable of reflection, not as beings dazzled into passivity, as beings who can invoke legal principle, not as beings who will accept whatever framing the arriving parties propose. This is why the first 4 warnings had to come first. This is why the emphasis on posture and observation and negotiation was necessary. Because all of that was the preparation for this specific argument the argument that the surface population is not the arriving party's property because the surface population meets the arriving party's own tests for personhood. Without the preparation, the argument cannot be made. With the preparation, the argument becomes available. And the argument, according to Enki, is winnable. Not certain to win, but winnable, if the small line is competent enough and steady enough and coherent enough to make it well. There is a further layer to the fifth warning that the reconstruction insists must be included. Enki, according to the transmission, expected that the arriving parties would attempt to sidestep the legal argument by invoking custom. They would argue that regardless of the abstract legal question, the practical arrangement across all the previous SARs has been one in which the surface population served the arriving parties' needs and provided the labor and the resources that the arriving parties required. Custom, in their tradition, has considerable legal weight. If a relationship has been conducted in a certain way for many generations, the relationship is presumed to continue in that way unless there is specific reason to change it. And the arriving parties will point to the temples, and the offerings, and the priesthoods, and the whole architecture of surface civilization since the founding expedition, as evidence that the customary arrangement is one of subordination. The counter-argument to this, according to Enki, is that the customary arrangement is a corruption. It was not what the founding expedition originally intended. Or more precisely, it was what one faction of the founding expedition intended, but not what the whole expedition intended, and certainly not what the ruling council on the parent world of the arriving parties formally authorized. The customary arrangement grew up on the surface partly because the arriving parties themselves encouraged it, and partly because the surface population, in the absence of clear counter-instruction, fell into it as a natural response to the presence of overwhelming power. But its long duration does not make it correct. And its correction is not, in the legal framework, a modification of a valid arrangement. It is a return to the original terms of the intervention, which were terms of design and cultivation, not terms of ownership. Enki intended the small line to argue for the return to original terms, to argue that the intervention was a design event, that the beings it produced developed into full persons, that the customary subordination since then has been a departure from the original intent, and that the current SAR is the correct moment for the departure to be corrected. This argument, according to the reconstruction, is the small line's strongest available position. It concedes the facts of the intervention. It invokes the arriving party's own principles. It reframes the whole history as a legal question rather than as a matter of divine authority. And it puts the small line on the ground of a party that is asserting rights, not on the ground of a party that is begging for favors. Enki was, however, honest about the difficulty of making this argument well, because the arriving parties will not accept it readily. They will have their own factions that resist it, particularly the factions that have benefited from the customary arrangement and that will lose standing if the arrangement is corrected. There will be council members who argue that the customary subordination is what the ruling council always intended, and that any attempt to overturn it is an act of rebellion by the surface population. There will be technical staff who argue that the practical difficulties of treating the surface population as full persons are too great to justify the reform. And there will be, in the reconstruction, at least one specific faction whose interest is in maintaining the surface population in a state of managed ignorance, because that state is convenient for the extraction of certain resources that the arriving parties still require. The small line, in making the fifth warning argument, will be arguing against all of these factions simultaneously. It will not have an easy time of it, and there is no guarantee that the argument will succeed. But the argument, according to Enki, is the argument that must be made, because the alternative is to accept the property status, and accepting the property status permanently forecloses the possibility of the surface population becoming what Enki designed it to eventually become, which is a self-governing species on its own trajectory, capable of managing its own affairs and, in due time, capable of entering into equal relations with the arriving parties on the basis of its own developed capacities. The fifth warning, taken as a whole, is a warning about the deepest question the return will pose, not a procedural question, not a logistical question, a question about what the surface population is and what its relation to the arriving parties will be for the remainder of the arrangement. The arriving parties will propose one answer to that question, and the answer they propose is subordination through property status. The small line, according to Enki, must be prepared to propose a different answer, and to defend that different answer with reference to the arriving party's own legal principles, and to make the defense stick under pressure. Whether it can do so depends on everything that comes before this moment, on the memory retained, on the language preserved, on the discernment cultivated, on the negotiation discipline established. All of the earlier warnings converge here. And everything after this warning depends on how the fifth warning is handled. Because if the small line accepts the property status, the subsequent warnings become largely irrelevant. There is nothing left to protect. If the small line successfully contests the property status, the subsequent warnings become operational because they describe what happens when the arriving parties begin to make more specific demands on a population that has retained its standing. The sixth warning, in the read wall sequence, is on the subject of the gold. And it is worth pausing before entering this warning to acknowledge that of all the warnings in the set, the sixth is the one that maps most directly onto features of the modern surface civilization that a listener today would recognize without needing to reach for the tablet record. Because the gold, in the arriving party's account, is not decorative, it is not symbolic. It is not a placeholder for wealth in the abstract sense. It is a specific material with a specific function that the arriving parties needed from this planet and that they set up the entire founding expedition to extract. And when they come back, according to Enki's transmission to Ziusudra, they are going to want to know what has been done with the gold in the intervening period, and they are going to make demands about the gold going forward that the small line will have to be prepared to respond to. The function of the gold, in the arriving party's technical apparatus, is atmospheric. Their parent world, according to the reconstruction, had at some point in its history developed a problem with the retention of certain critical gases in its upper atmosphere. Whether this was the result of internal geological changes on the parent world, or the result of external disturbances during its long elliptical orbit through varying regions of the solar arrangement, or the result of accumulated damage from the industrial activities of the arriving party civilization itself, is not clear from the tablet record. What is clear is that at a certain point in their history, the arriving parties determined that their parent world needed a corrective. They needed to seed the upper atmosphere of their parent world with a specific particulate material that could reflect and disperse solar radiation in a controlled way, buying time for the underlying atmospheric problems to be addressed by other means. The material they identified as suitable for this purpose was gold, in a specifically prepared micrometer particulate form, and the quantity they required was very large, larger than their own parent world could readily supply from its own reserves, so they mounted expeditions to other worlds in search of the supplemental supply. This planet, according to the transmission, was one of the worlds that offered promising deposits, and the founding expedition was sent here specifically to develop the extraction infrastructure that would supply the gold to the parent world program. The infrastructure they set up was extensive, mining operations in southern regions of what is now Africa, particularly in the areas around the Great Watershed where the earliest evidence of large-scale gold extraction has in fact been documented by mainstream archaeology. Additional operations in the mountain ranges of what is now South America. Additional operations in the northern ranges of what is now Eurasia. Refining sites at specific locations that were chosen for their combination of accessibility and shielding, one of the most important of which was a plateau on the peninsula that now lies between the two major bodies of water in the northeastern part of the arid belt. And shipping capacity, in the form of what the tablets describe as sky vessels that could carry the refined material back to the parent world on the SAR cycle when the two worlds were in favorable relative position. All of this infrastructure was operated, in its early phases, by the arriving parties themselves, but their own personnel found the work exhausting, and internal dissent within the expedition eventually led to what the reconstruction calls the mutiny at the mining sites. The mutiny is the specific event that motivated the design of the human labor form. If the arriving party's own personnel would not work the mines any longer, another labor source would have to be produced. The intervention that led to the current human species was, in significant part, the response to this specific operational problem. The gold flowed for a period of several SARs. According to the reconstruction, the extraction rate reached the point where the parent world atmospheric program had adequate supply, and the emergency phase of the program was concluded. But the ongoing maintenance of the parent world atmosphere continued to require regular supplemental deliveries, and the infrastructure on this planet was maintained in operational condition even during the periods when the arriving parties were not physically present. This was one of the primary functions of the surface staff mentioned in the third warning. To keep the mining infrastructure and the refining sites and the shipping platforms in operational condition during the long intervals between visits, so that when a new visit occurred, extraction could resume without a prolonged setup phase. Then came the flood, and the flood, among many other consequences, disrupted the extraction infrastructure, Some of the mining sites were flooded and had to be pumped out. Some of the refining sites were damaged. Some of the shipping platforms were destroyed. And the surface staff, in the immediate aftermath, was reduced to a small residual number that could not maintain everything simultaneously. When the arriving parties returned after the water receded, they found their infrastructure in disrepair and had to make decisions about what to restore and what to abandon. According to the reconstruction, they chose to restore a subset of the infrastructure and to abandon another subset, and they left instructions for the newly reconstituted surface population, meaning the descendants of Ziusudra and the other survivors, to maintain what had been restored and to await further instructions. Those instructions, and this is where the sixth warning becomes operationally urgent, included specific expectations about what the surface population would do with the gold in the intervening period. The gold was to be treated as a strategic reserve. It was to be extracted at a moderate pace, sufficient to maintain the infrastructure and to accumulate a supply that would be ready for delivery when the arriving parties returned. It was not to be squandered. It was not to be diverted into surface applications that were not authorized. It was not to be treated as ordinary wealth that could be spent freely on whatever the surface civilization happened to want. It was to be held in trust, essentially, for the arriving parties' eventual return. And the surface leadership, whoever that leadership might be at any given moment in the intervening period, was to preserve this trust. The reader can already anticipate the problem, because the surface civilization, over the intervening SARS, has not preserved the trust. The gold, in the modern configuration of the surface civilization, has become the foundation of the entire monetary and financial architecture. It has been extracted on a massive scale, has been distributed across many hands, has been used as a store of value in ways that have nothing to do with the parent world atmospheric program, and has, in significant quantities, been literally consumed in industrial and decorative and dental applications that render it unrecoverable. The surface civilization has, in the accounting that the arriving parties will apply when they return, dissipated a strategic reserve that was entrusted to it. And the arriving parties will notice, and they will have questions, and their questions will not be gentle. Enki, according to the reed wall reconstruction, foresaw this precise problem. He warned Ziusudra that the surface population, over generations, would forget the significance of the gold and would treat it as ordinary wealth. He warned that specific interests would emerge that had a stake in continuing this treatment, because the interests in question had grown wealthy through it. And he warned that when the arriving parties returned, one of their most immediate demands would be for an accounting. What has happened to the gold? Where is it now? Who holds it? What arrangements can be made to recover the reserve that was entrusted? And, if the reserve cannot be readily recovered because it has been dispersed too widely, what compensation will be provided in its place, and by whom, and on what schedule? The sixth warning, therefore, is a warning that the small line must be prepared to answer these questions. It must have, in its long-term planning, a mechanism for tracking what has happened to the gold across the intervening period. It must have a defensible account of how the strategic reserve was managed, or mismanaged, and by which parties. It must have proposals for how the arriving parties' demands can be addressed without producing a general economic collapse in the surface civilization, which would be catastrophic for the surface population regardless of what the arriving parties eventually decide. And it must have, if possible, a negotiating position that recognizes the legitimate interest of the arriving parties in the material while defending the surface population from being reduced to strip mining its economic foundation to meet a debt that was accumulated over 3,000 years of forgotten instructions. Enki was not optimistic about the surface population's ability to handle the gold question well. According to the reconstruction, he expected the surface leadership at the time of the return to be in the hands of parties whose interests were substantially opposed to any coherent response to the arriving parties' demands. Parties who had grown wealthy through the dispersal of the strategic reserve would not want to reverse that dispersal. Parties who had built their political power on the current monetary architecture would not want to see that architecture destabilized. And parties who had personal relationships with the surface staff or with the broken parties described in the third warning might have information that they were not sharing with the broader surface population, information that would be relevant to how the gold question was resolved. The small line, according to the reconstruction, must therefore take an interest in the gold question that is independent of the interests of the surface leadership at the time of the return. It must have its own accounting. It must have its own understanding of what the strategic reserve was intended for and what the arriving parties are likely to demand. And it must have, ideally, its own proposals for how the demand could be met in a way that preserves the small line standing without destroying the surface civilization as a whole. This is a considerable analytical burden to place on a small line that is trying to hold together across many generations under difficult conditions. But the burden, according to Enki, is unavoidable, because the gold question will be one of the first substantive questions the arriving parties raise, and the way it is handled will set the tone for everything that follows. There is a further wrinkle in the sixth warning that the reconstruction insists must be included. Enki, according to the transmission, told Ziusudra that the arriving parties may not be able to be fully honest about their current needs with respect to the gold. He explained that on the parent world, the atmospheric program had itself gone through changes during the intervening SARS. There were factions on the parent world that argued the program was no longer necessary because alternative solutions to the underlying atmospheric problem had been developed. There were factions that argued the program was necessary as always. And there were factions that argued the program was being maintained not because of atmospheric necessity, but because certain interests on the parent world had grown accustomed to the flow of gold and to the wealth it produced for them, personally. These parent world factions, according to Enki, would each want the returning parties to represent their interests during the accounting proceeding with the surface population. And the returning parties would not necessarily present a unified position on what they actually needed the gold for. Some of them might argue that the atmospheric program required renewed extraction. Others might argue that alternative arrangements were possible. Others might argue that the strategic reserve was needed for other purposes that they did not want to discuss openly. The small line, according to the reconstruction, should watch for these internal divisions among the returning parties and should use them where possible to reach a resolution that reflects the actual state of the arriving parties' needs rather than the state of their factional politics. The sixth warning, taken as a whole, describes what will probably be the single most contentious substantive question in the return proceeding. And it prepares the small line to enter that question with an accounting of its own, a set of proposals of its own, and an awareness of the arriving parties' internal complexities that can be leveraged during negotiation. Whether the small line can execute this preparation depends on the same factors that determine the outcome of the other warnings: memory, language, discernment, discipline, and time. Time to prepare, time to gather, time to think through the position, time which, if the second warning has been understood correctly, is not unlimited but is at least available, because the reading of the returning signature gives the small line advance notice. The SAR closes over decades, not minutes. The small line that has been paying attention has room to get ready. The small line that has not been paying attention will be caught unprepared, and the gold question will be answered for them by whichever parties on the surface happen to be the ones the arriving parties speak with first. Which, as Enki knew, is unlikely to be a good outcome for the surface population as a whole. Before we move to the seventh, stop. What you heard about the gold demand only makes sense on the full timeline. Next to the 7 resets before it, software wiped, 1 line spared. It is all in the 7 resets, linked below. Grab it, come back, what is next builds on it. QR code is on your screen. The 7th warning, in the read wall sequence, turns from the substance of the negotiation to the physical geography of where the return will actually occur. Because the arriving parties, when they come down, will not land in random locations. They will not choose their descent points on the basis of what the surface population would consider convenient or diplomatic or symbolically appropriate. They will land at specific sites that were prepared during the founding expedition and that have been maintained across the intervening SARs either by the surface staff or by their own automated systems. These sites are the staging sites, and the 7th warning is about what they are, where they are, why they matter, and how the small line should behave in relation to them as the return approaches. The staging sites, according to the reconstruction, fall into several categories. The first category is the landing platforms proper. These are the sites where the sky vessels physically descend and where the arriving parties' personnel disembark for their surface operations. The founding expedition established several of these platforms, at locations that were selected for a combination of geographic stability, atmospheric conditions, and proximity to the other categories of infrastructure the expedition required. The most important of these platforms, according to the tablet record, was located on a plateau in the peninsula between the 2 seas in the northeastern portion of the Great Arid Belt. That platform was operational throughout the founding expedition and continued to be operational during subsequent return visits. It was, in Enki's transmission, one of the primary locations that the small line should be aware of, both because the arriving parties would use it as a descent point on the current return and because the small line should not, under any circumstances, attempt to gather at the platform in the period leading up to the arrival. The reason for this last point is one of the more counterintuitive elements of the seventh warning, and it deserves careful attention. Because the natural inclination of a surface population that has become aware of the imminent return would be to prepare a formal reception, to gather at the landing site, to greet the arriving parties in an organized and dignified way, to be present when the ramp lowers and the personnel steps out. Enki, according to the reconstruction, warned specifically against this inclination. The arriving parties, on arrival, will conduct their own perimeter procedures before making formal contact with any surface population. Those procedures will involve the securing of the site, the establishment of communication with their own surface staff, the assessment of the immediate environment, and the initial review of whatever documentation and materials the surface staff has prepared for their arrival. During this period, which may extend across days or weeks, depending on the specific mission profile, the arriving parties will treat any unauthorized presence in the vicinity of the landing site as a potential threat, and their response to potential threats, according to the tablet record, is not gentle. They will use their vessel's defensive systems to clear any area that is judged to require clearing. They will apply their weaponry, if they consider its application necessary, without prior negotiation with whoever happens to be in the affected zone. And they will conduct these actions on the basis of their own operational protocols, which do not include a step for asking the surface population what its intentions might be. Therefore, the small line, and any wider surface population that the small line can persuade to follow its lead, should stay away from the landing sites in the initial period of the arrival, not out of subordination, not out of fear, out of practical understanding of how the arriving parties operate. Contact with the arriving parties should happen through channels that the arriving parties themselves recognize as legitimate, meaning through their own perimeter procedures and their own outreach to designated surface representatives, not through spontaneous gathering at the landing zones. This is one of the specific operational instructions that Enki was most insistent about in the read wall session. It is the kind of instruction that can seem paranoid or overcautious in the abstract, but that, in the actual moment of a vessel descent, will prove to have been the correct instruction. Populations that gather at landing sites in the initial hours after descent, according to the reconstruction, are populations that are treated as environmental hazards to be cleared. Populations that stay back and make formal contact through the correct channels are populations that are treated as parties to a proceeding. The second category of staging site is the operational infrastructure. This includes the mining sites already described in the sixth warning, but also the refining sites, the communication relays, the power generation facilities, and the storage depots that the founding expedition established and that the surface staff has maintained. Several of these sites are still active. Some of them are dormant, but capable of being reactivated on relatively short notice. Some of them have been forgotten by the surface population entirely and are located in areas that are considered geologically uninteresting or that are physically inaccessible without the specific equipment that the arriving parties possess. The arriving parties, when they return, will visit these operational infrastructure sites early in their mission. They will assess their condition. They will bring them back online where necessary. They will meet with the surface staff at these sites, and they will make decisions about which sites will be used for the operations of the current visit. The small line, according to the reconstruction, should be aware of the general locations of the operational infrastructure, but should not attempt to interfere with the arriving parties' activities at those sites. Interference will not succeed. The technology involved is beyond what the surface civilization can effectively contest. And the arriving parties will consider interference to be a specific violation of their operating rights that will be recorded in the formal proceeding and used against the small line's negotiating position. What the small line should do is track the arriving parties' activities at these sites, understand what is being reactivated and what is being left dormant, and use that information to inform its negotiation posture. If a specific mining site is being reactivated, that tells the small line something about the arriving party's resource demands. If a specific communication relay is being brought online, that tells the small line something about how the arriving parties intend to coordinate their surface operations. All of this is intelligence that the small line can gather without confronting the arriving parties directly, and that can inform the small line's understanding of what the arriving parties actually need from the current visit. The third category of staging site is the assessment infrastructure. These are the sites where the arriving parties will conduct their evaluations of the surface population itself, its condition, its capacities, its distribution, and its readiness to enter into the proceedings that will constitute the current visit's main work. The assessment infrastructure, according to the reconstruction, includes several sites that are located near major population centers of the surface civilization and that are designed to observe those population centers over sustained periods. Some of these sites are located at what appear to be ancient religious or ceremonial sites, and the small line may be familiar with them under those descriptions without being aware of their original function. Others are located at what appear to be geological features or landscape elements that have never been recognized as constructed, but that were in fact placed by the founding expedition for observational purposes. The specific list of these sites, according to the reconstruction, is not fully recoverable from the tablet fragments, but the general principle is that the arriving parties have been watching the surface for a very long time and have infrastructure in place to continue that watching whenever they return. The fourth category, and this is where the seventh warning becomes most operationally sensitive, is the departure infrastructure. These are the sites from which the arriving parties will conduct their final operations before leaving the surface at the conclusion of the current visit. The departure infrastructure is important because it is where the outcome of the visit is finalized. Any agreements that have been reached during the visit will be formalized at the departure sites. Any personnel who are being taken by the arriving parties, whether as representatives of the surface population or as prisoners or as designated agents, will be embarked at the departure sites. Any materials that are being removed from the surface will be loaded at the departure sites, and the final instructions to the surface population for the interval until the next return will be transmitted from the departure sites. The small line, according to the reconstruction, must be aware of the departure infrastructure not only as landing zones to avoid, but as the location where the outcome of the current visit will be committed to the record. Whatever the small line has managed to negotiate during the visit becomes real, in a sense, at the moment of departure, and the small line's ability to be represented at that moment, in whatever way its own protocols allow, is important. There is a further element to the seventh warning that must be included, because it addresses a question that will inevitably arise as the return approaches, which is the question of what to do about the fact that many of the staging sites are located in areas that are now occupied by dense surface populations that have no idea of the site's significance and that are conducting their own affairs. At or near those sites, the Great Plateau in the northeastern arid belt is not unpopulated. The mining regions in the southern watersheds are not unpopulated. The mountain ranges of the south and the north are not unpopulated. Even the more remote sites often have surface populations in reasonably close proximity. When the arriving parties come down, they are going to interact, in some way, with these local populations. And the local populations are not the small line. The local populations are not necessarily prepared. The local populations will, in most cases, react in exactly the ways that the first warning tried to prevent, by falling on the ground, by treating the arriving parties as gods, by offering resources and allegiance without negotiation. The small line, according to the reconstruction, cannot prevent these local reactions. It cannot be present at every staging site. It cannot educate every surface population that happens to live near an important site about the correct way to respond to the arrival. What it can do, and what Enki insisted it must do, is preserve within itself the correct understanding, so that as the situation develops, and as the arriving parties conduct their assessments, and as the local populations respond in various ways, there is at least a coherent small line that can be pointed to as the party representing the correct posture. The small line does not need to be numerically large. It does not need to control the surface population. It needs, above all, to be identifiable. To be findable by the arriving parties, when the arriving parties look for a party to negotiate with, and to be internally consistent enough that when it is found, it can carry the negotiation through without collapsing into the same patterns that the surrounding populations have collapsed into. The seventh warning, taken as a whole, is about geography and about the relationship between the arriving parties' operational needs and the small line's negotiation posture. It is a warning that says the arrival will happen at specific places, that those places are known to some extent from the tablet record and are inferable to some extent from the observation of the surface, that the small line should not approach those places carelessly, but that the small line should understand what is happening at those places so that its negotiation is grounded in the actual operational reality of the visit. Enki, according to the reconstruction, considered this warning practical rather than dramatic. It was not designed to inspire fear or reverence. It was designed to keep the small line out of the way of the arriving parties in the initial phase, and to give the small line the situational awareness it needed in the subsequent phases. Which, as with the other warnings, is what allows the small line to remain a functional party to the proceeding rather than becoming, in the arriving party's operational reports, a collection of non-combatant casualties that were cleared from an active landing zone. The eighth warning, in the read wall sequence, addresses the internal structure of the arriving parties themselves. Because up to this point, the warnings have been treating the arriving parties as if they were a single unified actor with a single unified purpose. That framing is useful for the earlier warnings, because it emphasizes the basic operational principles that the small line will need to apply regardless of the arriving party's internal complexities. But it is not fully accurate. The arriving parties, according to Enki's transmission to Ziusudra, are not a single unified actor. They are a coalition. They are a council with factions. They are a species with internal politics and internal disagreements and long-standing rivalries between specific lineages and specific interest groups. And the small line, once it has gotten past the initial phase of the return and has entered into substantive proceedings with the arriving parties, will find itself dealing not with a monolith but with a collection of parties whose interests do not fully align and whose disagreements can be, in certain moments, exploited to the small line's benefit. Enki, according to the reconstruction, was uniquely well positioned to explain this internal structure to Ziusudra because he had been part of it for a very long time. He knew the factions, he knew the personal histories, he knew where the alliances were strong and where they were weak. He knew which council members owed which other council members and what those debts were about. And he transmitted, in the read wall session, a considerable amount of specific information about the arriving party's politics that the reconstruction has preserved in fragmentary form. Not all of the specifics survive intact. Some of the personal names have been corrupted in the transmission. Some of the alliance descriptions are incomplete. But the general structure is recoverable, and it is what the eighth warning transmits to the small line. The structure, in its highest level abstraction, is a division between two major factions, with a smaller third faction that shifts between them depending on the specific question. The first major faction, which Enki himself belonged to, is the faction of the designers. This faction includes the members of the founding expedition who were involved in the technical work of establishing the presence on this planet. Chief among them are the scientific staff who conducted the intervention that produced the human labor form, the engineers who designed and built the operational infrastructure, and the field naturalists who conducted the initial surveys of the surface biosphere. These parties, as a rule, developed over the course of their long involvement with this planet a certain investment in the outcomes of their work. They are the ones who care about the surface population as something more than a resource. They are the ones who consider the intervention to have produced beings whose developmental trajectory deserves to be respected. They are, in the framework of the arriving party's politics, the reformist faction. They favor arrangements with the surface population that recognize its personhood and that provide it with the space to continue developing on its own terms. The second major faction is the faction of the operators. This includes the command staff of the founding expedition and their descendants, the security and enforcement personnel who conducted the actual operations on the surface, and the resource management specialists whose primary concern was the flow of materials back to the parent world. These parties, as a rule, developed a different attitude toward the outcomes of the expedition. They saw the intervention that produced the human labor form as a solution to a specific operational problem, and they saw the labor form itself as, essentially, a tool. Whatever the labor form has developed into over the intervening period, from their perspective, does not change its fundamental status. The surface population is a resource that was engineered to serve specific purposes, and the current visit is an opportunity to reassert the proper relationship between the surface population and the arriving party's operations. They are, in the framework of the arriving party's politics, the traditionalist faction. They favor arrangements with the surface population that maintain its subordinate status and that continue to treat it as a means to the arriving party's ends. Between these two factions, there is a third, smaller faction that Enki called the Observers. This faction consists of council members who were not centrally involved in either the design work or the operational work of the founding expedition, but who have long-standing interests in the political outcomes of the expedition and who tend to vote on specific questions on the basis of what they consider to be in the long-term interest of the arriving party's civilization as a whole. The Observers, as a rule, are less predictable than either of the two major factions. They can sometimes be persuaded to support the reformist position, particularly when they judge that the traditionalist position is likely to produce instability or long-term costs. They can sometimes be persuaded to support the traditionalist position, particularly when they judge that the reformist position is likely to require more resources than the arriving parties currently have available. And they can sometimes be persuaded to support alternative arrangements that neither of the major factions has proposed but that fit the observer's own assessment of what is required. The small line, according to Enki, should pay particular attention to the observer faction, because the observer faction is often where the votes that decide the actual outcome come from. Beyond this three-faction structure, at the level of the council, there are additional layers of internal complexity that the eighth warning addresses. There are, according to the reconstruction, family lineages within the arriving parties that carry their own multi-generational agendas. There are professional guilds within the technical staff that have their own institutional interests. There are territorial associations that relate to different regions of the parent world and that maintain their own political networks even during the long expedition. And there are, most importantly for the small line, specific personal relationships between individual council members that either strengthen or weaken the formal factional alignments. Enki, according to the transmission, told Ziusudra about several of these personal relationships in some detail, which council members had personal grievances against which other council members, which relationships were based on mutual obligation, which alliances were fragile and could be shifted by specific developments during the return proceeding. Much of this specific personal information has been lost in the transmission. What remains is the general principle that the arriving parties' council is a body of individuals with individual interests, and the small line can, in principle, appeal to those individual interests to shape the collective outcome. The eighth warning, therefore, is an instruction in what one might call diplomatic intelligence. The small line, in preparing for the return, should not treat the arriving parties as an undifferentiated adversary. It should study the internal structure. It should identify which factions are likely to favor which outcomes. It should identify which specific council members are likely to be receptive to which specific arguments. And it should design its negotiation posture with an awareness of the internal politics on the other side of the table. This is a considerable analytical task, and it depends on the small line having access to reasonably good information about the arriving party's current political configuration, which in turn depends on the small line having maintained enough continuity with the tablet record and enough contact with the surface staff described in the third warning to have a working knowledge of who the current parties are and where they stand. Not all small lines across the intervening SARs will have maintained this level of intelligence. Some will have lost it entirely. Some will have partial information. Enki was realistic about this, and he provided in the transmission, according to the reconstruction, a fallback set of principles that a less well-informed small line could still apply. The fallback principles are these. Even without specific intelligence about the current factional configuration, the small line can assume that there will be factions. The small line can assume that some of those factions will be more sympathetic to the small line's position than others. The small line can assume that the arriving parties, as a rule, will conduct their proceedings through their own internal disputes, as well as through the direct negotiation with the surface population. And the small line can act, in the negotiation itself, in ways that are more likely to strengthen the reformist factions than to strengthen the traditionalist factions. What actions strengthen the reformist factions? Actions that demonstrate the surface population's personhood in ways that the reformist factions can point to during their own council debates. Actions that make it easier for the reformist factions to argue that the surface population deserves recognition. Actions that make it harder for the traditionalist factions to argue that the surface population is merely a resource. And, correspondingly, the small line should avoid actions that make the reformist faction's position harder to defend, meaning actions that fit the traditionalist description of what the surface population is likely to do if left to itself. Actions that appear irrational. Actions that appear ungrateful. Actions that appear to violate the fundamental terms of the earlier arrangements. These actions strengthen the traditionalists and weaken the reformists. Even if the small line believes the earlier arrangements are unjust and should be repudiated, taking action to repudiate them in a manner that fits the traditionalist description will make it harder for the reformists to defend the small line's underlying position. There is a specific example in the reconstruction that illustrates this principle. Enki, according to the transmission, told Ziusudra that in prior return proceedings, individual members of the surface population had sometimes taken dramatic action against the arriving parties, such as attempting to sabotage certain infrastructure or attempting to attack specific personnel. These actions were, in each case, unsuccessful, but they were also, in each case, used by the traditionalist factions in the arriving parties' council as evidence that the surface population was fundamentally uncontrollable and required stricter management. The reformist factions had to spend political capital defending the surface population against these accusations, rather than advancing their positive agenda. And the outcome of those proceedings was generally worse for the surface population than it would have been if the dramatic actions had not been taken. The small line, according to Enki, should therefore restrain individual members from taking such actions during the current return, not because the actions are illegitimate in themselves, but because they will predictably damage the small line's negotiating position more than they will damage the arriving party's operations. The eighth warning, taken as a whole, is a warning about complexity, about the fact that the return proceeding is not a simple encounter between two homogeneous parties, but a multi-layered political process with internal dynamics on both sides. About the need for the small line to develop the intelligence and the discipline to navigate this complexity without being either naive about it or paralyzed by it, and about the specific analytical framework that the small line can apply, even without perfect information, to distinguish actions that are likely to help its position from actions that are likely to hurt it. Enki was, according to the reconstruction, more optimistic about this warning than about several of the others, because he judged that the arriving parties' factional divisions were genuine and durable, and would provide the small line with real opportunities to shape the outcome. Whether the small line would recognize those opportunities and use them well was another question, one that Enki could not answer in advance, and that depended, in the end, on what kind of small line survived the intervening SARS and arrived at the return, proceeding with sufficient competence to make the reformist case. The ninth warning, in the read wall sequence, brings the reader back to a subject that was touched on in the earlier warnings but not fully developed: the ME. The civilizational software packages that the founding expedition installed on the surface as part of its establishment of the arrangement with the original human population, and that have, in various forms, remained running across the intervening SARS. Because when the arriving parties come down, one of their principal analytical tasks will be to conduct an audit of the ME, to determine which packages are still running, to determine how they have drifted from their original specifications, to determine which packages have been corrupted or lost or replaced by surface improvisations, and to determine, on the basis of that audit, what remedial action is required. The ME, in the original Sumerian terminology, were understood by the surface population that received them as sacred objects. They were represented in the tablets and in the associated iconography, as tablets themselves, or as scrolls, or as symbolic objects that could be handled and transferred and, in one famous account, stolen by one deity from another and transported to a different city. This mythological framing was, according to the reconstruction, a simplification of what the ME actually were. The ME were, in Enki's own terminology, coded packages. They were structured instruction sets that governed specific domains of civilizational activity. There was a package for law and jurisprudence. There was a package for the calendar and the ritual year. There was a package for kingship and the succession of authority. There was a package for craft, meaning the transmission of technical knowledge across generations. There was a package for family structure and the norms governing marriage and inheritance and lineage. There was a package for the temple system and the organization of formal religious activity. There was a package for warfare and the ethical constraints on it. There was a package for agriculture and the management of the seasonal cycle. There were packages for trade and for measurement and for language and for the arts. There was, in the fullest catalog that the reconstruction has been able to assemble, something on the order of 100 distinct packages that together constituted the operating system of the civilization that the founding expedition established. The packages were, in the technical sense that Enki explained to Ziusudra, self-reinforcing. Each package contained not only its explicit instructions, but also mechanisms for maintaining itself across generations. Rituals that reinforced the underlying norms. Stories that encoded the operative principles. Institutional structures that required the norms to be maintained in order for the institutions themselves to function. This self-reinforcement was intentional. The founding expedition wanted the ME to survive across the long intervals between visits, when there would be no direct supervision from above, and when the surface population would be left to its own devices. The self-reinforcement was the mechanism by which continuity was to be maintained, and to a significant degree, according to the reconstruction, it worked. The ME did continue to operate across the intervening SARS, in modified forms and under different names, and in fact continue to operate today, in forms that most members of the surface population do not recognize as descended from the founding expedition's original packages, but that nonetheless retain the underlying structure. The audit that the arriving parties will conduct when they come down, according to Enki's transmission, will focus on several specific questions. First, which packages are still operational? Second, what modifications have been introduced to those packages? And are those modifications compatible with the underlying design intent? Third, which packages have been replaced by locally developed alternatives, and how do those alternatives compare in function to the original packages? Fourth, which packages have been lost entirely, and what have been the consequences of their loss? Fifth, and this is the most delicate of the audit questions, are there any surface developments that appear to represent entirely new packages, meaning civilizational innovations that were not in the founding expedition's original catalog but that have emerged from the surface population's own creative activity? This last question is delicate because it touches directly on the fifth warning's central issue. If the surface population has developed new packages, that is evidence of its personhood in a way that the arriving party's own tradition considers legally significant. But it is also evidence that the surface population has been operating outside the founding expedition's design parameters, which the traditionalist faction will consider a violation of the original arrangement. The small line, according to the reconstruction, must be prepared to speak intelligently about the state of the ME at the time of the return. This requires the small line to have, in its own long-term memory, some understanding of which surface institutions and practices trace back to the original packages and which represent surface developments. It requires the small line to have some analytical capacity to distinguish between the two. And it requires the small line to have, ideally, a defense of the surface developments as legitimate expressions of the personhood that the fifth warning is trying to establish. Not all surface developments will be defensible in this way. Some of them will have been corruptions, drifts from the original packages that have produced dysfunctional outcomes. The small line should be willing to concede these, where the concession does not undermine the broader case. What it should defend, aggressively, is the surface developments that represent genuine advances in the underlying capacity of the surface civilization. Advances in scientific understanding, advances in institutional design, advances in the humane treatment of members of the surface population who have historically been marginalized. All of these can be presented, according to the reconstruction, as evidence of the surface population having grown into the personhood that Enki designed it to eventually achieve. And that presentation is central to the fifth warning's argument. The complication, and there is always a complication in the Reedwall transmission, is that some of the packages that the founding expedition installed were, in their original form, structured in ways that limited the surface population's development. The traditionalist faction, according to Enki, had wanted the packages to keep the surface population in a state of manageable subordination indefinitely. The reformist faction, led by Enki himself, had argued for packages that would allow the surface population to develop toward personhood over the long term. The compromise that was reached at the founding, according to the reconstruction, produced a set of packages that were mixed in their orientation. Some elements were oriented toward development, other elements were oriented toward subordination. Over the intervening SARs, the surface population has, in various regions and various historical periods, either strengthened the developmental elements or strengthened the subordination elements, depending on the specific choices made by specific leadership groups at specific moments. When the arriving parties conduct their audit, they will find this mixed record, and the two factions in the arriving parties' council will interpret the mixed record differently. The traditionalists will point to the surface population's departures from the subordination elements as evidence that the surface population has become dangerous and requires stricter management. The reformists will point to the surface population's development beyond the subordination elements as evidence that the surface population has become worthy of recognition and requires expanded standing. The small line, according to the reconstruction, should be prepared to support the reformist reading of the audit by pointing to specific examples of developmental advances, by acknowledging the departures from subordination, where they are genuine improvements, and by declining to accept the traditionalist framing of those departures as inherently threatening to the arriving party's interests. There is a further layer to the ninth warning that must be included, because it addresses what may be the most sensitive element of the audit. The reconstruction indicates that one of the original packages, and one of the packages that the arriving parties will pay particular attention to, is the package that governs what Enki called the persisting layer, meaning the norms and practices around what happens to the essential organized pattern of an individual after the death of the biological form. This package, in its original form, was designed to allow the arriving parties to conduct a certain kind of ongoing analysis of the surface population's development. Individuals who had reached particular states of development were to have their patterns preserved and made available for study by the arriving parties' technical staff. This preservation was represented in the surface population's understanding as various forms of afterlife or continuation of the soul, but its actual operational function was analytical. It was a way for the arriving parties to keep track of what was happening on the surface without having to be physically present all the time. The audit will inquire about the state of this package, whether the surface population still has functional practices around the persisting layer, whether those practices are still routing patterns in a way that the arriving parties can access, or whether the practices have degraded to the point that the flow of patterns has been interrupted and the arriving parties are missing large blocks of information about surface developments during the intervening SARS. If the flow has been interrupted, which the reconstruction suggests is at least partially the case, the arriving parties will want to know why, and they will want to know what has happened to the patterns that would normally have been routed to their analytical infrastructure. This is a question with implications that go beyond the audit itself, because the answer to it touches on the 11th warning, on the persisting layer directly, which we will come to in due course. For the 9th warning, the point is only that the persisting layer package is part of the ME audit and will be examined during the return proceeding, and the small line should be prepared for questions about its current state. The 9th warning, taken as a whole, is a warning about the accounting for the civilizational structure, about the fact that the surface civilization is not a random development of the surface population's own creativity, but is built on foundations that the founding expedition installed and that have been maintained, modified, and in some cases lost across the intervening SARS. About the fact that the arriving parties will want to know what has become of those foundations and will draw conclusions about the surface population's condition on the basis of what they find, and about the need for the small line to be prepared, when the audit is conducted, to speak intelligently and defensively about what is there and what is not there, and what has developed on the surface's own initiative, and what deserves defense as an achievement rather than being conceded as a failure. This preparation, like the other preparations that the warnings require, has to happen in advance of the return. It cannot be assembled at the moment of the audit itself, because the audit will be conducted at the pace that the arriving parties choose, and the small line will need to have its material ready when the questions are asked. The 10th warning turns to what may be the most seductive element of the entire return proceeding, because at some point in the negotiations, and probably at a point that the arriving parties consider tactically well chosen, they will make an offer. The offer will not be phrased as a demand. It will not be phrased as an accounting. It will be phrased as a gift, or as a favor, or as an opportunity that the arriving parties, in their generosity, are willing to extend to the surface population as part of the current visit. The offer will be the offer of technology. Specifically, the offer of specific technological knowledge or capability that the surface civilization does not currently possess, and that the arriving parties, in their long history, have developed and could share if the appropriate arrangements can be reached during the current proceedings. The technologies on offer, according to the reconstruction, will vary depending on the specific mission profile and depending on the arriving party's assessment of what the surface population currently needs and what it is currently ready to receive. Some of the offers will involve advances in medicine, including treatments for conditions that the surface civilization has not learned to treat and extensions of the biological lifespan of individual members of the surface population. Some will involve advances in energy production, including access to power sources that would end the surface civilization's dependence on the extraction of chemical energy from the ground. Some will involve advances in transportation, including access to vessel technology that would allow the surface population to move rapidly across the surface and, in more advanced offers, to leave the surface entirely and travel within the local solar arrangement. Some will involve advances in communication, computation, and information processing that would transform the operational capacity of the surface civilization. And some will involve advances in what Enki called the deeper technologies, meaning knowledge that touches on the fundamental structure of the physical arrangement, including the nature of the persisting layer discussed in the 11th warning to come, and the relationship between the observed physical world and the underlying substrate that generates it. These offers, according to the reconstruction, will be genuine. The arriving parties possess the technologies in question. They are capable of transferring them, in various forms, to the surface civilization if they choose to, and under certain conditions, they will make the transfer. But the transfers will not be without conditions. and the conditions are the substance of the 10th warning. Because the arriving parties will not offer their technology in exchange for nothing. They will offer it in exchange for specific commitments from the surface population, commitments that will be recorded in the formal proceeding and that will bind the surface population for the remainder of the SAR and possibly beyond. The 10th warning is a warning about what those commitments are likely to require and about why the small line, in the vast majority of the cases, should decline the offer, even when the offer seems overwhelmingly attractive. The commitments that the arriving parties will typically require in exchange for technology transfers fall into several categories. The first category is the resumption of specific activities that the surface civilization has, at various points in the intervening SARs, allowed to lapse. The most prominent of these is the extraction and delivery of the strategic reserve material discussed in the 6th warning. Technology transfers, in most of the offer configurations, will be conditional on the surface civilization committing to a resumption of gold extraction at specified rates and to the delivery of specified quantities on a specified schedule. This is, from the arriving party's perspective, a straightforward exchange. They provide access to advanced technology. The surface civilization provides access to a material they still need. But the small line, according to the reconstruction, should be extremely cautious about accepting arrangements of this type because they will restore the surface civilization to a working relationship with the arriving parties that the 6th warning is specifically trying to move the civilization away from. The second category of commitment is the acceptance of ongoing supervisory presence. In many of the offer configurations, the technology transfer will be conditional on the arriving parties establishing a permanent surface presence in the form of monitoring stations, technical staff, and administrative personnel who will oversee the deployment of the transferred technology and ensure that it is being used in ways consistent with the arriving party's intentions. This supervisory presence would, over time, transform the arriving parties from occasional visitors on the SAR schedule into a continuous authority on the surface, which would, in effect, undo the entire negotiation posture that the earlier warnings have been working to establish. The small line, according to the reconstruction, should be particularly careful about arrangements of this type, because they trade a short-term technological gain for a long-term structural loss of autonomy that will be extremely difficult to reverse. The third category of commitment is the modification of specific surface institutions and practices to bring them into alignment with the arriving party's preferences. This is where the 10th warning intersects most directly with the 9th warning on the audit of the ME. The arriving parties will, in various offer configurations, propose that in exchange for technology transfer, certain surface institutions be reformed in specific ways. Which institutions and which reforms will depend on the audit findings and on the current factional politics on the arriving party's side. Some of the proposed reforms will look, from the surface perspective, like improvements. Some will look like restorations of arrangements that the surface population had, on its own initiative, moved away from. Some will look like reversions to conditions that the surface population had considered oppressive and had struggled to end. The small line, according to the reconstruction, should evaluate each proposed reform on its own merits, not on the merits of the technology transfer that is being offered as an inducement. Because a reform that would be considered unacceptable in itself does not become acceptable just because it is being offered as part of a bundle that includes attractive technology. The fourth category of commitment is more abstract but potentially more consequential. It involves specific undertakings by the surface population about the future direction of its development. The arriving parties will, in some of the offer configurations, propose that the surface population commit to certain limits on its own future evolution. Limits on what technologies the surface population will independently develop. Limits on where the surface population will travel. Limits on what forms of contact the surface population will attempt with other civilizations that may exist elsewhere in the local region. These commitments would, if accepted, effectively contain the surface population within a defined developmental envelope, with the arriving parties retaining the authority to enforce the containment. The technologies being offered would allow the surface population to reach the boundaries of that envelope more quickly. But the envelope itself would prevent further development beyond those boundaries. This is, according to the reconstruction, one of the most dangerous forms of offer that the arriving parties are likely to make, because it appears to accelerate the surface population's development while actually setting a permanent ceiling on that development that the surface population will not be able to raise unilaterally. The small line, according to Enki's transmission, should approach the offer of technology with a specific principle in mind. The principle is that technology which is developed by a civilization on its own initiative, at its own pace, through its own understanding, is different in kind from technology that is transferred to a civilization by an external party as part of a proceeding. Not different in what the technology can do, but different in what the possession of the technology implies for the civilization's standing. A civilization that has developed a specific capability on its own has, in the developing of it, exercised the qualities that constitute personhood in the arriving party's own tradition. It has observed, reflected, chosen, and constructed. It has made itself, in some measure, the equal of the parties that possess similar capabilities. A civilization that has been given the same capability, without going through the process of developing it, has not exercised those qualities in relation to that specific capability. It has, in a sense, been granted the appearance of the capability without the underlying substance of the personhood that would normally accompany it. And this distinction, according to Enki, matters in the long run, because a civilization that has been given capabilities without earning them tends to be treated, by parties that have earned similar capabilities, as a client rather than as a peer. The 10th warning is therefore, at its core, a warning against the acceptance of gifts from parties whose interests are not fully aligned with the interests of the recipient. Not because the gifts are worthless, they are not worthless. Many of them would represent immense practical benefits to the surface population, but because the gifts come with strings attached, and the strings, over time, will limit the surface population's freedom of action and will lock the surface population into a role that Enki considered incompatible with the developmental trajectory he had originally intended for it. The small line should, as a rule, decline the offers of technology, even when declining them requires the surface population to endure hardships that could otherwise be avoided. The endurance of the hardships is part of the process by which the surface population earns its own capabilities. The acceptance of the offers would shortcut the process at the cost of the standing that the process was supposed to establish. There is one specific category of offer, however, that the reconstruction indicates deserves separate treatment. The arriving parties may, in the course of the proceeding, offer to share what they know about the history of contact between them and the surface population. Information about the founding expedition, information about the flood and its causes and its aftermath, information about the specific interventions that produced the current human species, information about the ME and their design and their intended function. This category of offer is different from the offers of operational technology because what is being transferred is understanding rather than capability. And understanding, according to Enki, is something that the small line should be more willing to accept because understanding is the foundation on which the surface population can make its own subsequent choices with clearer eyes. The small line should still be careful about the terms attached to the sharing of information, but the sharing of information, in itself, does not carry the same risks as the sharing of operational capability. And in certain configurations of the proceeding, the sharing of information may in fact be one of the more valuable outcomes that the small line can extract, because it fills in the historical picture that the small line has been working with on the basis of fragmentary tablets and reconstructed transmissions and, in some cases, guesswork. The 10th warning, taken as a whole, is a warning about the discipline of refusal, about the fact that the surface population, in the moment of the return, will face temptations that are genuinely attractive and that the natural response to those temptations, in the absence of specific counter-instruction, will be acceptance. Enki, according to the reconstruction, considered the discipline of refusal to be one of the most difficult things he was asking the small line to maintain, because the offers will look good, the people making them will present themselves as benefactors. The consequences of refusal will include practical hardships that the surface population would prefer to avoid. But the acceptance of the offers, according to Enki, would foreclose the possibility of the surface population becoming what it was designed to become, which is a self-governing species on its own developmental trajectory, capable in the fullness of time of standing as an equal party to any civilization it encounters, including the civilization of the arriving parties themselves. That trajectory is the prize that the 10th warning is trying to protect, and the discipline of refusal, difficult as it is what protects it. The 11th warning returns to territory that the 3rd warning already touched on, but now with greater specificity, because as the return approaches, the small line will need not only to distinguish the arriving parties from other categories of contact, but to understand in operational terms who exactly is already here and what they will do when the arriving parties come down. The 11th warning is about the parties already present on the surface, about the surface staff, about the ones who broke faith, about the beings on adjacent frequencies, and about a 4th category that the 3rd warning did not fully address, and that becomes especially important in the context of the return. The surface staff, to review from the third warning, are the members of the arriving party species who have remained on the surface across the intervening SARs in an authorized capacity, maintaining the operational infrastructure and awaiting the return. Their numbers are small, their locations are dispersed, their function is technical and administrative rather than political. When the arriving parties come down, the surface staff will make immediate contact with them and will hand over their operational logs and their assessments of the current surface conditions. From the small line's perspective, the surface staff should be treated as an extension of the arriving parties rather than as a distinct category. Whatever the surface staff has been observing or recording will be available to the arriving parties within the first hours or days of the return. The small line should therefore assume, throughout the intervening period, that any activity that could be observed by the surface staff has been observed. This is not necessarily reason for alarm. The surface staff has, according to the reconstruction, been observing surface activity for a very long time without dramatic intervention. But it is reason for realism about what the arriving parties will know when they arrive. The ones who broke faith, the second category from the third warning, present a more complex operational picture, because their standing with the arriving parties is not what the surface staff's standing is. The broken parties, whatever their original grievances against the ruling council, are still nominally accountable to that council. When the arriving parties come down, one of their tasks will be to determine what to do about the broken parties. In some cases, the broken parties may be reintegrated into the arriving parties' formal structure. In other cases, they may be treated as fugitives from the ruling council's authority and subjected to whatever proceedings the council prescribes for such fugitives. In still other cases, the broken parties may attempt to negotiate their own arrangements with the arriving parties, possibly using their surface influence as leverage. The small line, according to the reconstruction, should be aware of these dynamics and should be cautious about any offers of alliance or assistance that come from parties who claim to be aligned with the small line's interests, but whose ultimate loyalties are unclear. Some of these offers will come from the broken parties, and their motivations will not be what they appear to be on the surface. The beings on adjacent frequencies, the third category from the third warning, become particularly active in the period of the return. According to the reconstruction, these beings have their own understanding of what the return proceedings will involve, and they see the period of the return as an opportunity to advance their own agendas in the surface population. Some of them will attempt to make contact with individuals in the surface population who may be receptive to their teachings. Some of them will attempt to influence the outcome of the arriving parties' proceedings by feeding specific information or misinformation to specific parties on either side. Some of them will attempt to position themselves as intermediaries between the surface population and the arriving parties, offering to translate or to represent or to advise. The small line, according to the reconstruction, should be extremely wary of any such offers. The beings on adjacent frequencies do not have standing in the arriving parties' formal proceedings. Any information they offer to the small line, or any offer of intermediation they make, is not authorized by the arriving parties' council, and cannot be relied on as an authentic representation of the arriving parties' positions. The small line should insist on dealing directly with the arriving parties through channels that can be verified against the tablet record, and should decline offers of intermediation from parties whose standing cannot be verified. The fourth category, which the third warning did not fully address, is what Enki called the arrangements. This category consists of specific ongoing structures on the surface that have been established over the intervening SARs, by combinations of surface staff, broken parties, and beings on adjacent frequencies, and that continue to exert influence over specific aspects of surface civilization. These arrangements are not, in themselves, beings. They are organizations. They are networks. They are, in some cases, specific institutions or lineages within larger institutions that have been shaped over long periods by contact with one or more of the other categories, and that continue to operate on the surface in ways that reflect the influence of that contact. The small line, according to Enki, should be aware that these arrangements exist and should understand that some of the actions that appear to be taken by ordinary surface institutions are, in fact, being directed by parties who are not visible in the ordinary account of those institutions. The specific identification of these arrangements is not something the reconstruction preserves in detail. Enki was, according to the fragment, deliberately vague about naming specific arrangements in the transmission to Ziusudra because he anticipated that the specific arrangements would change over time. New ones would form, old ones would dissolve, Different combinations of categories would produce different kinds of arrangements at different points in the intervening SARs. What he wanted to preserve was not a list of current arrangements, but the general awareness that arrangements exist, that they operate in ways that are not fully visible to the general surface population, and that their influence on the return proceeding may be significant even if it is not openly acknowledged. The small line should look for evidence of these arrangements in the pattern of surface institutional behavior. Institutions that consistently act against the apparent interests of their stated constituencies may be showing the influence of an arrangement. Networks of individuals across otherwise unrelated institutions who make similar decisions at similar times may be showing the influence of an arrangement. Specific historical events that appear disproportionate to their surface causes may have been shaped by the influence of an arrangement. None of this is to say that the arrangements determine everything on the surface. According to Enki, they do not. The surface civilization has its own dynamics that operate independently of the arrangements, and much of what happens on the surface is fully explicable in terms of ordinary surface causation without reference to any arrangement at all. But some things are not fully explicable in that way, and for those things, the possibility of arrangement influence should be considered. And in the specific context of the return proceeding, when the stakes are unusually high, and when parties on all sides will be maneuvering for advantage, the arrangements can be expected to be unusually active. The 11th warning gives specific operational guidance about how the small line should conduct itself in relation to these categories during the period of the return. First, the small line should maintain its own internal communications through channels that are as difficult as possible for any of the other categories to monitor or interfere with. This does not mean paranoid secrecy about everything. It means basic discipline about the transmission of sensitive information, particularly information that relates to the small line's negotiating positions and its assessments of the arriving party's factional politics. Second, the small line should be prepared to receive approaches from parties that claim to represent one or another of the other categories, and should have protocols for evaluating those approaches without being immediately committed to trusting or distrusting them. Third, the small line should maintain its own memory of the tablet record and its own capacity for verification, so that when claims are made by parties from the other categories, the small line can check those claims against the record without having to rely on the parties themselves to verify their own claims. There is a specific procedural note in the fragment that deserves inclusion. Enki, according to the reconstruction, told Ziusudra that in the period immediately before the return, one of the most common patterns of interference from the other categories would be the appearance of teachings that closely resembled the small line's own teachings, but that contained specific alterations designed to shift the small line's negotiating posture. These pseudo-teachings would appear in various forms from various sources. They might be presented as newly discovered tablets. They might be presented as inspired transmissions from parties claiming to represent Enki himself or other members of the ruling council. They might be presented as sudden collective insights that came upon groups within the small line without an identifiable source. In each case, the alteration would be subtle. It would not obviously contradict the received teaching. It would, however, shift the emphasis, or add a new element, or reinterpret an existing element in a way that, when compared carefully to the original, would prove to be a departure. The small line, according to the reconstruction, should maintain the discipline of comparing all such claimed teachings against the original tablet record, and should refuse to incorporate teachings that cannot be verified against the record, no matter how compelling their immediate presentation. Beyond these procedural cautions, the 11th warning has a broader message about the nature of the environment the small line will be operating in during the return period. The environment will be crowded. It will not be a simple two-party negotiation between the small line and the arriving parties. It will involve many parties, with many interests, operating. The small line will have to distinguish between these parties, to attribute actions and communications correctly, and to maintain its own coherent position through all of the noise. This is not an easy operational task. It requires disciplines that have to be practiced in advance, structures that have to be established before they are needed, and habits of verification that have to be routine rather than exceptional. Enki, according to the reconstruction, was under no illusion about the difficulty of this task, but he insisted on the necessity of it. Because a small line that cannot distinguish among the parties operating in the return environment will be manipulated by those parties. And manipulation, at the crucial moments of the proceeding, will produce outcomes that the small line did not intend and that it will not be able to reverse. The 11th warning, taken as a whole, is a warning about the density of the environment, about the fact that the arriving parties are not the only parties whose activities will affect the outcome of the return, and that the other categories of activity, though less visible, are potentially just as consequential. It prepares the small line to conduct its own operations with the situational awareness that a crowded environment requires, and it points forward to the 12th warning on the ultimate resolution of the entire proceeding and on what the small line should be aware of when the resolution comes. The 12th warning is the final warning. It is the warning that Enki, according to the reed wall reconstruction, transmitted last, in the final portion of the long night at Shurupak, when Ziusudra was already exhausted, and when the water was already beginning to rise in the distance, and when the vessel was already loaded and ready. It is the warning that does not make sense unless the previous 11 have been heard and understood, and it is the warning that Enki himself, according to the fragment, considered the most important of the set because it addresses what happens if everything else fails. What happens if the small line, despite all its preparation, is unable to prevent the return proceeding from going badly? What happens if the arriving parties conclude the audit unfavorably, deny the personhood argument, restore the property claim, extract the resources they came for, and depart with the arrangement placed back into the framework that Enki had spent so much of his own effort trying to move it out of? The 12th warning is what to do if that happens. And it is what to do if, worse than that, the proceeding does not simply go badly but escalates into what Enki called the conclusion. The conclusion, in the reconstruction, is a specific possibility that lies at the far end of the space of outcomes the return could produce. It is the possibility that the arriving parties, after conducting the audit and reviewing the state of the surface population and considering the options available to them, conclude that the arrangement as a whole is no longer viable and should be terminated. Termination, in this context, does not mean a simple departure. It means the deliberate elimination of the surface population and the reset of the planet's surface to a condition that can be reinitialized with a new labor form if the arriving parties decide such a form is still needed, or that can be simply abandoned. If the arriving parties decide the parent world atmospheric program has developed alternative solutions and the extraction operations on this planet are no longer worth the trouble. This possibility, according to the reconstruction, is not the most likely outcome of the return. It is not even in the top 3 of likely outcomes. But it is a possibility that exists within the space of outcomes, and it has been reached before, at earlier points in the history of the arriving parties' activities, on other planets where they had established labor arrangements that ultimately did not work out. Enki, in his transmission to Ziusudra, felt obligated to include the possibility because he considered the small line entitled to know what the full range of outcomes might be. The 12th warning, therefore, has 2 levels. The first level is the level of degraded outcomes short of the conclusion, outcomes in which the proceeding goes badly. The property claim is restored. The strategic reserve is recovered as fully as possible. Various commitments are extracted from the surface population, but the surface population itself continues to exist and to develop, though under conditions less favorable than what Enki had hoped for. In these outcomes, the small line must continue to preserve the teachings, must continue to hold to the 5th warning's argument even when it has been rejected in the current proceeding, and must position itself to make the argument again in the next SAR, when the return proceeding will happen again and when the circumstances may have changed. Continuity in these degraded outcomes is what the 12th warning is asking the small line to preserve. The second level is the level of the conclusion. And here the 12th warning becomes something different from all the warnings that came before. Because if the conclusion is being prepared, the ordinary tools of the negotiation are no longer available. The proceeding is no longer aimed at reaching an arrangement. It is aimed at implementing the termination. The arriving parties, in this scenario, would signal the change in mission profile through specific behaviors that the small line should be able to recognize. The withdrawal of formal negotiation, the consolidation of their vessels at specific staging sites, the activation of specific weapon systems that have been dormant across the intervening period, the evacuation of the surface staff and the broken parties and any other associated categories from the surface, the final departure of any parties who intend to survive the conclusion, and then the initiation of whatever specific mechanism they have selected for the termination itself. If these signs are observed, the 12th warning offers the small line a specific course of action. The action is not resistance. Resistance would fail. The technological asymmetry is too great. The action is not appeal. Appeal would not be heard. The proceedings have already been closed. The action is preservation. Preservation of the essential teachings. Preservation of the essential lineage. Preservation, in whatever form is possible, of the memory that this happened and of the reasons why it happened. Because even in the case of the conclusion, according to Enki, the story does not end at the surface of this planet. The arriving parties themselves have their own history, their own memory, their own ongoing accounting of what they have done and why they did it. And that accounting, according to the reconstruction, includes higher structures beyond the ruling council itself, structures that oversee the arriving parties' conduct across the various worlds they interact with, structures that maintain a record of what has been done to the various labor populations that have been established and then terminated, structures that will, in due course, review the arriving parties' conduct on this planet as part of their long-term review of the arriving parties' overall performance as a species. Those structures exist above the ruling council. They are not answerable to the ruling council, and they will, in the fullness of time, ask questions about what was done here. This is why the 12th warning insists on preservation, because preservation, in the case of the conclusion, is not for the immediate benefit of the surface population, which will not survive to receive the benefit. Preservation is for the record that will eventually be reviewed by the higher structures. Preservation is for the moment, however distant, when the arriving parties themselves are held to account for what they did on this planet. And in that moment, according to Enki, it will matter that there was a small line that maintained the correct teaching, that made the correct arguments, that preserved the memory of the intervention and its consequences, that documented the failure of the return proceeding, and that carried its record through to whatever endpoint the record ultimately reaches. The record itself, according to the reconstruction, is what Enki was most concerned to preserve, and the small line, in its final and most desperate function, is the vehicle for that preservation. How the record is preserved, in the case of the conclusion, is a question that the reconstruction addresses only partially. Enki, according to the fragment, told Ziusudra that certain measures had been put in place at the founding in anticipation of exactly this contingency. Certain repositories had been established at locations that were designed to survive various kinds of surface catastrophe. Certain patterns had been encoded into the persisting layer arrangements in ways that would allow information to be recovered even after the biological population was gone. Certain arrangements had been made with parties whose standing was outside the ruling council and whose interest in the record's preservation was independent of the arriving party's current politics. The small line, according to Enki, could avail itself of these measures if the conclusion appeared imminent and could contribute its own additions to the record so that the account of what happened at this particular SAR would be complete when the record was eventually reviewed. The specific mechanics of how the small line would contribute to the record are not fully preserved in the reconstruction. Some of the fragment is corrupted at exactly this point. Some of it uses terminology that the modern translators have not been able to render intelligibly. What can be recovered is the general principle. The small line, in the case of the conclusion, should not attempt to survive in the ordinary sense. It should focus its remaining time and its remaining resources on making the record as complete and as accurate as possible, and on ensuring that the record reaches the mechanisms that Enki established for preserving it. Some members of the small line may be able to survive by physical means, but the survival of members is not the primary task. The survival of the record is, and the small line that fully absorbs the 12th warning will act on that priority, even at the cost of individual survival, because the individual survival is not what the whole preparation has been about. The preparation has been about the record, about the account, about the case that will eventually be argued before the higher structures on the surface population's behalf, whether or not the surface population itself is present to argue it. This is a hard warning. Enki, according to the reconstruction, acknowledged that it was hard. He did not ask Ziusudra to be enthusiastic about receiving it. He did not offer false hope about the likelihood of the conclusion being avoided. What he offered was clarity. Clarity about what the conclusion would look like if it happened. Clarity about what the small line's function would be in that scenario. And clarity about why the function mattered. It mattered because the arriving parties, according to Enki, would themselves eventually face review. Not immediately. Not on any timeline that would benefit the surface population directly. But over the very long term, on the scale of the arriving party's civilization's own trajectory, the review would come. And in the review, the record of what was done on this planet would be part of the evidence. And the record, if it was preserved, would speak. It would speak for the surface population that was designed by Enki and that developed toward personhood and that made its case and had its case rejected. It would speak for the small line that maintained the teaching under difficult conditions across many SARs. And it would speak, in Enki's own name, for the position that he had held throughout his participation in the founding expedition. The position that the intervention had produced persons, that the persons had rights, and that the arriving party's conduct toward those persons would eventually have to be justified in terms that the higher structures would accept or would not accept. There is a further layer to the 12th warning that must be included, and it is the layer that Enki, according to the reconstruction, was most personally invested in, the layer that concerns his own presence at the eventual review. Enki, in the transmission, made a commitment. He committed to being present when the review of this planet's history was conducted by the higher structures, at whatever point in the future that review takes place. He committed to speaking for the record, to representing the case that had been developed on the surface, and to arguing for the outcome that the case suggested. This commitment, according to Enki, was not conditional on his own political standing within the ruling council at the time of the review. It was not conditional on his continued existence in his current form or under his current name. It was a commitment to be at the review in whatever capacity was necessary to make the case that the record would be arguing. This commitment is important, according to the reconstruction, because it means the small line is not alone in the long term. Even if the conclusion occurs and the surface population is terminated, the record persists, and the record has a designated representative at the eventual review. That representative is Enki himself, or whoever occupies his role at that point in the arriving party's history. The small line's function is to prepare the record. Enki's function is to argue it. The two functions are complementary, and together, they constitute the small line's stake in the future beyond the current SAR, even in the most degraded scenario the return could produce. The 12th warning, taken as a whole, is a warning about the ultimate, about the possibility that things could go very badly, about what to do in that case, and about the deeper structure that gives even the worst case a meaning that extends beyond the immediate outcome. It is the warning that turns the whole set of warnings into something more than a survival manual for the return proceeding. It turns them into a case file that will be argued, someday, before parties whose judgment matters more than the ruling council's judgment. And it puts the small line, in its final function, in the position of the party that assembled the file. That is not a comfortable position. But it is, according to Enki, an important position. And it is a position that the small line, if it has followed the earlier warnings correctly and has maintained its preparation across all the intervening SARs, will be able to occupy when the moment requires. That is what the 12th warning is for. That is what all of the warnings, taken together, are for. The proceeding will happen, the case will be made, the record will be preserved, and in the fullness of time, the record will be heard. Having walked through all 12 warnings in the order that Ziusudra received them, it is worth taking a moment to look back at the whole sequence as a single integrated instruction. Because the warnings are not, in Enki's design, 12 independent items on a list. They are 12 stages of a single argument, each of which depends on the ones before it and each of which sets up the ones that follow. Understanding the whole sequence as a single argument, rather than as a collection of separate topics, is what allows the small line to hold the warnings together as an operating framework, rather than losing them piece by piece under the pressure of the actual return. The argument begins with the first warning, on the nature of the returning parties themselves. The whole sequence would collapse if this first warning were not correctly absorbed. Because if the small line falls into the position of treating the arriving parties as gods, everything after this point becomes theater. The small line is no longer a party to a proceeding. It is a supplicant before a divinity. And a supplicant before a divinity does not negotiate, does not evaluate offers, does not maintain positions, does not make cases. The first warning is the foundation on which all the other warnings rest, and it must be held steadily throughout the entire proceeding. No matter how impressive the vessels are, or how tall the personnel are, or how compelling the atmosphere of the encounter becomes, they are a species. Older, more capable, but a species, not gods. This is the starting position, and from it, everything else follows. The second warning, on the signature of the return, is what gives the small line the ability to prepare in advance. Without the recognition of the signature, the arrival would be a surprise, and a small line that is surprised by the arrival has no chance to make the preparations that the later warnings require. The signature has multiple components. The astronomical component, which involves the appearance of the returning parent world in the observational window. The atmospheric component, which involves the electromagnetic and magnetic disturbances associated with the parent world's approach. The biological and geological components, which involve the responses of the biosphere and the crustal activity of this planet. All of these together produce the reading, and the reading gives the small line the advance notice it needs to gather itself, organize its representatives, and prepare its positions before the arrival itself. The small line that is watching for the signature will not be caught unprepared. The small line that is not watching will be. The third warning, on recognition protocols, is what allows the small line to sort through the various categories of contact that will be active in the period of the return and to attribute them correctly. The returning parties are one category. The surface staff is another. The ones who broke faith are a third. The beings on adjacent frequencies are a fourth. Confusing these categories with each other produces incorrect responses at critical moments. The tools for recognition are provenance, coherence, and the signature of intent. And the small line must be able to apply these tools skillfully to whatever contacts present themselves during the return period. Without this recognition capacity, the small line will be misled by parties whose interests are not the interests they claim to represent, and it will act on the basis of that mislead in ways that damage its position. The fourth warning, on first contact behavior and negotiation posture, translates the recognition capacity into concrete conduct. When the arriving parties come down and begin the formal proceeding, the small line's opening moves must be careful. Do not swear allegiance. Do not offer resources. Do not agree quickly. Ask for time. Ask for clarifying information. Treat every request as a transaction rather than as an offering. And do not, under any circumstances, allow individual members of the small line to make agreements on behalf of the whole that the whole did not authorize. The fourth warning is what sets the terms of the proceeding itself, and if the terms are set correctly at the beginning, the small line has room to conduct the rest of the negotiation from a stable position. If the terms are not set correctly, everything after the opening moves is a struggle to recover from a bad opening. The fifth warning, on the genetic claim, addresses the deepest substantive question the arriving parties will pose. The claim that the surface population is their property. The response, according to Enki, is not to deny the facts of the intervention, which are substantially correct in the arriving party's account. The response is to invoke the arriving party's own legal tradition, which recognizes personhood as the distinguishing feature that separates persons from property, and to argue that the intervention produced full persons, with all the qualities that the arriving party's own tradition uses to define personhood, and that, therefore, according to their own tradition, the surface population is not property but persons, and the property claim is invalid. This is the small line's strongest available position, and everything before this point has been setting up the ability to make this argument well. The sixth warning, on the gold demand, addresses what will probably be the most concretely contentious, substantive question. The arriving parties will want an accounting of the strategic reserve material and will make demands about its recovery. The small line must have its own accounting, its own understanding of what has happened to the material across the intervening SARs, and its own proposals for how the demand can be addressed without producing catastrophic collapse of the surface economic architecture. The sixth warning is where the negotiation becomes most technical and where the small line's preparation has to be most detailed. Without specific technical preparation on the gold question, the small line will be forced into whatever arrangement the arriving parties propose, and the arrangement will be one that serves the arriving parties' needs at whatever cost to the surface civilization. The seventh warning, on the staging sites, addresses the physical geography of the return, where the arriving parties will land, where their operational infrastructure is located, where they will conduct their assessments, and where they will finalize the outcomes at their departure. The small line should understand this geography, should stay clear of the landing sites in the initial phase of the arrival to avoid being cleared as an environmental hazard, and should track the arriving parties' activities at their various sites as intelligence for the ongoing negotiation. The seventh warning is where the small line's understanding of the arriving parties' operations becomes practical rather than abstract. The eighth warning, on the council structure, opens up the internal politics of the arriving parties themselves. The reformist faction, the traditionalist faction, the observer faction, the various lineages and guilds and territorial associations that complicate the simple factional picture, the specific personal relationships between individual council members that either strengthen or weaken the formal factional alignments. The small line should study these internal complexities and design its negotiating posture to strengthen the reformist factions while avoiding actions that would strengthen the traditionalist factions. The eighth warning is where the negotiation becomes political in the strict sense of the word. The ninth warning, on the audit of the ME, addresses the arriving party's analytical review of what has become of the civilizational software packages that the founding expedition installed. The small line must be prepared to speak intelligently about which packages are still running, which have been modified, which have been replaced, and which have been lost. and it must be prepared to defend surface developments that represent genuine advances as evidence of the personhood that the fifth warning is trying to establish. The ninth warning is where the small line's understanding of the surface civilization's history becomes an asset in the ongoing negotiation. The 10th warning, on the offer of technology, addresses the seductive temptations that the arriving parties will present in exchange for specific commitments from the surface population. Access to advanced medicine, access to alternative energy sources, access to transportation and communication technologies, access, in the most advanced offer configurations, to the deeper technologies that touch on the fundamental structure of the physical arrangement. The small line, according to the reconstruction, generally decline these offers because they come with strings attached that would foreclose the surface population's own developmental trajectory. Only the offer of understanding, meaning historical and structural information rather than operational capability, should be treated as potentially acceptable. The 10th warning is where the discipline of refusal becomes central, and where the small line has to hold to its long-term interests against the pressure of short-term inducements. The 11th warning, on the parties already here, revisits the categories from the third warning with greater operational specificity in the context of the return itself. The surface staff, which will consolidate with the arriving parties immediately, the ones who broke faith, whose ultimate loyalties are unclear, and whose offers of alliance should be received cautiously, the beings on adjacent frequencies, who will attempt to insert themselves into the proceedings through various offers of intermediation, and the arrangements, meaning the ongoing structures that combine members of these various categories with elements of the surface civilization and that continue to exert influence in ways that are not fully visible. The 11th warning is where the small line's operational discipline becomes most demanding, because the environment it has to navigate is dense and multi-layered. The 12th warning, finally, is on the ultimate resolution, on what happens if the proceeding goes badly, on what happens, in the worst case, if the arriving parties conclude the proceeding by initiating a conclusion, on the small line's function of preserving the record even in that scenario, on Enki's own commitment to being present at the eventual review by the higher structures beyond the ruling council, and on the meaning that this deeper structure gives to the whole exercise, even if the immediate outcome is not what the small line hoped for. The 12th warning is where the case file is completed and where the small line's stake in the future extends beyond the current SAR into the very long-term arc of the arriving party's own accountability. Taken together, the 12 warnings form what could be called a complete manual for how a small line should conduct itself in the period of a return. They cover the preparation, they cover the recognition, they cover the negotiation, they cover the substantive issues, they cover the internal politics, they cover the technical audit, they cover the temptations, they cover the environmental complexity, and they cover the ultimate resolution. Nothing that the small line will encounter during the return is left entirely unaddressed. And nothing that is addressed in isolation from the rest of the sequence. The whole set moves as a single argument from the initial position of not falling on the ground to the final position of preserving the record for the higher structures. Each stage of the argument depends on the ones before it. Each stage sets up the ones that follow, and the whole holds together, in the reed wall reconstruction, as an integrated instruction that Enki, according to the fragment, considered his most careful and most complete work on the question of what the small line would need to know in order to survive the return proceeding intact. The order of the warnings, as noted at the beginning of this recording, is part of the message. If the warnings had been received in a different order, the argument would not develop correctly. If the 10th warning came before the 5th, the small line would not have the personhood framework to evaluate the offers of technology. If the 12th warning came before the 11th, the small line would not have the situational awareness to interpret the signs of the conclusion. If the second warning came before the first, the small line would have the signature recognition without the underlying orientation to interpret what the signature means. And so on through the sequence. The order matters because the argument is cumulative, it builds. And the small line that receives the warnings in order, and holds them in order, and applies them in order, is the small line that is best positioned to make the whole argument work under the pressure of the actual return. And this brings us back, at the end of the long journey through the warnings, to where we started, to Shurupak, on the flat land between the two rivers, in the last generation before the Great Water, to the reed hut, to the man on one side of the wall and the being on the other, to the pitch-coated jar and the mud floor, to the specific moment, in a specific night, when a species that had been designed by another species for one purpose received, from the very party who had designed it, an operating manual for what it could become and how it could defend that becoming against the parties whose interests were in keeping it in the original purpose. The reason this whole account has weight for a listener in the current era is that the same tablet fragments that carry the 12 warnings also carry the flood story that the standard Sumerian curriculum in the universities does teach, and the flood story that the universities teach maps, in dozens of specific details, onto the story that appears centuries later and in modified form in the Hebrew scriptures and, in modified form again, in the Greek and Roman accounts of the deluge, and in various forms across the mythologies of nearly every ancient civilization that has left a written record. The convergence of these accounts, according to the scholars who have worked most seriously on the question, is not accidental. It reflects a common source. And the common source, according to the underlying tablet record that the excavations of Layard and Rassam and their successors began pulling out of the mud of the Assyrian capital in the middle of the 19th century, is the account that Ziusudra received on that specific night at Shuruppak. The account included, among other things, the boat instructions and the passenger list and the pitch specifications and the coordinates for landing after the water went down. It also included, according to the reed wall reconstruction that certain scholars have preserved outside the mainstream peer review process, the 12 warnings. The scholarship on the reed wall reconstruction is not universally accepted. Mainstream Assyriology, for reasons that have as much to do with academic politics as with the underlying evidence, has largely declined to engage with the more elaborate readings of the transmission that Enki gave to Ziusudra. The tablets themselves are acknowledged to exist. The passages that describe the reed wall communication are acknowledged to be present. The general outline of Enki's role in warning the flood hero is acknowledged to be part of the received text. What is disputed is the elaboration, the specific content of what Enki told Ziusudra beyond the immediate flood instructions. Whether the transmission included, as the reconstruction argues, a longer sequence of instructions about what would happen after the flood. Whether the reconstruction, which draws on tablets from multiple collections and on comparative analysis with related textual traditions, faithfully represents what was actually in the original account or represents a modern imposition on ambiguous source material. This dispute, according to the scholars who have worked on the reconstruction, will not be resolved by the standard methods of academic Assyriology because the standard methods are constitutionally hesitant to accept the underlying framework that the reconstruction requires. The framework involves accepting that the arriving parties in the account were literal beings from a literal parent world, that the intervention that produced the human labor form was a literal genetic intervention, that the flood was a literal event caused by literal astronomical dynamics, that the promises of return are literal promises about literal future events. Mainstream Assyriology treats all of these elements as mythological, as figurative language reflecting the religious cosmology of a particular ancient civilization, not as descriptions of empirical realities, and within that treatment, the elaboration of the reed wall transmission into a set of operational instructions about future contact is not something the framework can accommodate. So the elaboration is either dismissed as speculation or ignored as irrelevant, depending on the particular scholar. The reconstruction, however, does not require the mainstream framework to be correct. It requires only that the tablet fragments be examined without the mainstream framework's prior commitments. When the fragments are examined that way, according to the scholars who have done the examination, they yield a consistent picture that supports the elaborated reading. Not proves it, but supports it. Enough to justify taking the elaborated reading seriously as a possible representation of what the account actually contained, and enough to justify presenting the 12 warnings, as this recording has done, as a coherent set of instructions that the small line was intended to preserve across the intervening SARs. Whether the listener accepts the reconstruction or does not accept it is, in the end, a personal decision. The evidence is not conclusive in either direction. What the reconstruction offers is a specific framework for interpreting a specific set of ancient texts, a framework that has significant implications for how the modern surface civilization understands its own history and its own future. If the framework is correct, the modern civilization is currently living in the closing period of a very long arrangement, and the return that Enki warned Ziusudra about is either underway or imminent, and the questions that the warnings prepare the small line to answer are questions that the modern civilization will actually have to answer in some form within a time frame that is short enough to matter to people currently alive. If the framework is not correct, then the tablet fragments are still important as records of an ancient religious tradition, but they do not carry the operational significance that the warnings assign to them, and the modern civilization can continue about its business without needing to prepare for a return that will never come. The recording cannot resolve this question for the listener. What it can do is present the framework in its full form so that the listener has the option of considering it seriously, because the framework, if it is even possibly correct, deserves consideration. And consideration, at this point in the history of the modern civilization, is not something that the standard educational institutions are providing. The standard institutions are committed to a set of interpretive frameworks that exclude the possibility that the reconstruction represents. Those interpretive frameworks may be correct. They may not be. But their commitment to excluding certain possibilities means that the possibilities in question are not being weighed on their merits. They are being excluded on procedural grounds. And a listener who wants to make an informed decision about which framework to accept has to seek out the excluded possibilities on their own initiative because the standard institutions will not provide them. That is, in part, what this recording is for. To provide, in a form that is accessible outside the standard institutions, a reasonably complete version of the reconstructed transmission that Ziusudra received, so that the listener who has been curious about the elaborated reading of the flood tradition, or who has been curious about the ancient astronaut framework in general, or who has been curious about the Sumerian and Akkadian record in specific, can encounter that framework in a form that presents its internal logic clearly. Whether or not the listener accepts the framework afterward is not the recording's concern. What the recording aims to provide is the substance of the framework, laid out in the order that the reconstruction assigns to it, with the internal connections between the warnings made visible so that the whole set can be evaluated as an integrated argument. For the listener who does accept the framework, or who accepts it provisionally as a working hypothesis to be tested against further evidence, there are practical implications that the recording should make explicit before it closes. The first implication is that the current historical period is, by the reconstruction's account, the closing period of the long arrangement. The signature of the return, in the sense described in the second warning, is either partially active or fully active depending on how the observations are interpreted. The astronomical component, in the sense of a returning body approaching the inner region of the local solar arrangement, remains disputed in the mainstream observational record but is claimed by certain independent observers to be visible under specific conditions. The atmospheric component, in the sense of unusual electromagnetic and magnetic activity, is being documented in the modern instrumental record in patterns that certain analysts consider consistent with the reconstruction's descriptions. The biological component, in the sense of anomalies in animal behavior and migratory patterns, is present in the modern ecological record, though its interpretation is contested. The geological component, in the sense of increased seismic and volcanic activity, is likewise present and likewise contested. All of these are being read by parties who accept the reconstruction as consistent with the reading that indicates the SAR is closing. The second implication is that, if the SAR is closing, the preparation that the earlier warnings require is not a task for future generations but a task for the current generation, or at least for a generation that is now living. The specific timing of the arrival, if it comes, is not knowable with precision from the tablet record. The window that the reconstruction describes extends across decades. But the preparation cannot be completed in the moment of the arrival. It has to be built up in advance, which means that if any of it is to be built up at all, the building has to begin now. Not in some indefinite future when the signature is more unambiguous. Not in some indefinite future when the mainstream institutions have caught up with the elaborated reading. Now, in the moment when the listener is hearing this recording, or as close to that moment as the listener can arrange. The third implication is that the preparation, in its practical form, does not require the listener to do anything dramatic. The preparation is about memory and understanding and orientation. It is about knowing the framework well enough to interpret events as they unfold. It is about maintaining the mental capacity to distinguish among categories of contact when the moment comes. It is about being available, when the moment comes, to represent the position that the small line has been developing. Not everybody who accepts the framework needs to be a representative in the formal proceeding. Not everybody needs to be present at the sites where the negotiation happens. What is needed is that some substantial number of people, distributed across the surface population, have absorbed the framework well enough to recognize what is happening when it happens, and to respond in ways that support the small line's position rather than undermining it. The fourth implication is that the recording itself, and the tradition of recordings and writings and discussions that circulate the elaborated reading of the tablet record, is part of the preparation. Not the only part, and not necessarily the most important part, but a part, because the small line, if it is going to exist in a coherent form at the moment of the return, has to be built out of the individual absorptions of the framework by many people across the surface population. And those absorptions have to be built out of encounters with materials that present the framework accurately and completely. The recording is one such material. The listener, in encountering it and considering it, is participating, whether they intend to or not, in the process by which the small line is coming into being for the current SAR. The listener may or may not go further and become an active participant in the small line's activities. But the mere encounter with the framework, if it is taken seriously enough to be reflected on and remembered, is itself a contribution to the process. The fifth and final implication is what Enki would say, according to the reconstruction, if he were speaking directly to a listener in the current period. And here the fragment gives us a specific line, which the reconstruction has preserved and which the recording will close with. Enki, according to the fragment, told Ziusudra to tell the small line, across all the intervening SARs, that the small line was not alone, that the arriving parties, though they would come, were themselves accountable to structures beyond themselves, that the record, if it was preserved, would be heard, that the case, if it was made, would be argued, and that the specific being who had designed the original human labor form, and who had watched over it across the SARs to whatever extent his own political standing had allowed, had committed himself to being present when the ultimate proceeding took place. This commitment, according to the reconstruction, was not made lightly. It was not made as a rhetorical flourish. It was made as a specific undertaking that the fragment records in the specific language of the arriving party's formal legal tradition. And it is, in Enki's own accounting, the closest thing to a promise that the small line has, that the whole exercise of the warnings and the preservation and the record-making is not a futile gesture, but a genuine investment in an outcome that will matter in the fullness of time to parties whose judgment carries weight beyond the ruling councils. The recording, therefore, closes not with a warning, but with that specific note. The small line is not alone. The record will be heard, the case will be argued, and the specific being who was there at the beginning, and who arranged for the small line to exist in the first place by breaking the flood oath and speaking to the reed wall, has committed himself to being there at the end. Whatever the end turns out to be, whatever the review turns out to conclude, whatever the higher structures turn out to decide, he will be there. That is what he told Ziusudra. That is what the reconstruction preserves. And that is what the small line, across all the intervening SARs and into the current SAR, and out beyond it into whatever comes next, has to work with. The listener has now heard the 12 warnings in the order they were given. The listener has heard the synthesis of the warnings as an integrated argument. The listener has heard the closing account of what the whole set implies for the current historical period. What the listener does with the material from this point forward is the listener's own business. The recording does not ask for anything specific. It does not ask for the listener to sign up for anything, or to join anything, or to take any particular action. It only asks that the material be considered, that the framework be given at least the courtesy of an honest hearing before it is accepted or rejected, that the listener think, for themselves, about whether the tablet record actually says what the reconstruction says it says, and about whether what it says has the significance the reconstruction assigns to it, and about what the listener would do if the reconstruction turned out to be substantially correct. Whatever the listener concludes, the material is now available. It has been transmitted, in this form, in this recording, on this occasion. It joins the larger body of material that circulates outside the mainstream institutions and that keeps the elaborated reading of the flood tradition alive. And it contributes, in whatever small way, to the ongoing formation of a small line that could be, if the reconstruction is correct, the small line that the current SAR requires. Whether that small line will be sufficient, whether the preparation will be adequate, whether the arrival, if it comes, will be handled well. All of these are questions that will be answered, if they are answered at all, in the years to come. What can be said now, at the end of this recording, is only that the 12 warnings have been transmitted, one more time, into the ongoing stream of the surface civilization's memory, and that whatever the outcome, the transmission itself has been completed. Ziusudra received the warnings on that specific night at Shurapak. Their content has now, 3,000 years and more later, been offered again, in a form appropriate to the current medium, for whoever chooses to listen. That, in the accounting that Enki was concerned to preserve, is what matters. The transmission continues. the record accumulates. And the case, however far off the eventual proceeding may be, is being built one more careful hearing at a time. There is one further set of considerations that this recording should offer before it fully concludes, because they address a question that many listeners will have and that has not been directly answered by the material presented so far. The question is what specifically to watch for in the current period. What specific signs, what specific patterns, what specific developments in the visible world of the modern surface civilization would constitute evidence that the framework of the reconstruction is being borne out in real events, rather than remaining an abstract framework that may or may not correspond to anything actually happening? This is a reasonable question to ask, and it deserves a reasonably direct answer. The first specific pattern to watch for, according to the reconstruction, is the continued unfolding of the atmospheric and magnetic signature described in the second warning. The modern civilization has instruments that Enki did not have, and that Ziusudra did not have, and that the various small lines across the intervening SARs did not have. These instruments can detect, with considerable precision, changes in the magnetic field of the planet, changes in the composition of the upper atmosphere, changes in the electromagnetic environment of the local region of the solar arrangement. A listener who wants to follow the signature can consult the publicly available data from various observatories and space physics research institutions and track the trend lines for themselves. The trends, according to certain analysts who work outside the mainstream space physics community, are consistent with the general pattern that the reconstruction describes, though the mainstream community reads them differently. Which reading is correct will be determined, in the end, by whether the patterns continue in the direction the reconstruction anticipates or diverge from that direction. The listener can watch and can update their assessment as the data continues to accumulate. The second specific pattern to watch for is the pattern of specific institutional developments in the surface civilization that may reflect the influence of the arrangements described in the 11th warning. The reconstruction does not offer a specific list of which modern institutions are influenced by which arrangements, but it does offer a general profile. Institutions that consistently act against the apparent interests of their stated constituencies, networks of decision-makers across otherwise unrelated institutions who make similar decisions at similar times without visible coordination, specific historical events that appear disproportionate to their surface causes. A listener who observes these patterns in the current period is not necessarily observing evidence of arrangement influence. Many other explanations for such patterns are available, but the possibility of arrangement influence is one of the explanations that should be on the list of possibilities the listener considers, and that should be tested against further evidence as the patterns develop over time. The third specific pattern to watch for is the pattern of what could be called disclosure. The gradual public acknowledgement, by parties in the modern surface civilization who have historically been in a position to know about the contact history, of specific elements of that history that have previously been classified or concealed or dismissed. The reconstruction anticipates that such disclosure will continue and will accelerate in the period leading up to the return, because the parties who have been holding the information will, as the return approaches, come under increasing pressure to make it available to the general surface population in preparation for what is coming. The specific form and timing of the disclosure is not predictable from the reconstruction, but the general trend, if the reconstruction is correct, should continue in the direction of more information becoming available rather than less. A listener who tracks disclosure over the coming years can form their own assessment of whether the trend matches the reconstruction's expectations. The fourth specific pattern to watch for is the pattern of contact claims. The claims by individuals in the surface population that they have had specific encounters with parties they identify as consistent with one or another of the categories described in the third warning. The reconstruction does not accept all such claims uncritically. Many claims are fabrications. Many are misinterpretations of ordinary experiences. Many represent contact with parties that the reconstruction would classify as beings on adjacent frequencies rather than as members of the arriving party's species. But the pattern of the claims, taken in aggregate over time, is worth attention. If the claims are increasing in frequency, or if the specific content of the claims is beginning to converge on descriptions that match the reconstruction's expectations for the arriving parties, that would be consistent with the framework the reconstruction describes. The listener can follow the aggregate pattern of contact claims through the various publicly available compilations that certain researchers maintain, and can form their own assessment. The fifth specific pattern to watch for is the pattern of technological developments in the surface civilization that may reflect either transfer from external parties or acceleration of internal development in preparation for the return. The reconstruction does not offer a specific list of which modern technologies may reflect such influence, but it does offer a general profile. Technologies that appear suddenly, without the expected sequence of intermediate developments that would normally be observed in the historical record. Technologies whose fundamental principles are not fully explained by the publicly available theoretical framework. Technologies whose deployment produces effects that go beyond their stated purposes in ways that suggest the stated purposes were not the whole story. A listener who observes these patterns is not necessarily observing evidence of external transfer or of preparation for the return. But again, the possibility should be on the list of possibilities the listener considers. The sixth specific pattern to watch for is the pattern of what could be called reorientation among specific parties on the surface who have historically been aligned with what the reconstruction would classify as the traditionalist position. If certain institutions, or certain leadership groups, or certain sectors of the surface civilization begin, in the current period, to shift their public positions in ways that are more aligned with what the reconstruction would classify as the reformist position, that shift is worth attention. It may reflect ordinary political developments unrelated to the framework. It may also reflect the beginning of the internal negotiations that the reconstruction describes as intensifying in the period before the return. A listener who follows the shifts in position of major surface institutions can form their own assessment of whether the shifts match the reconstruction's expectations. None of these patterns, on its own, would constitute conclusive evidence for or against the framework. Any single pattern can be interpreted in multiple ways, and any single interpretation can be challenged by alternative explanations. What would constitute stronger evidence, according to the reconstruction, would be the convergence of multiple patterns in the same period. If the atmospheric signature is unfolding as expected, and the disclosure pattern is accelerating, and the contact claims are converging on specific descriptions, and the technological developments are showing anomalous acceleration, and the institutional reorientation is happening at a significant scale, all in the same period, then the framework's overall picture would begin to look more compelling. The listener who watches for these patterns over a period of years, and who tracks their development in aggregate rather than trying to draw conclusions from any single pattern in isolation, is in the best position to form a considered assessment of whether the framework is being borne out by the visible developments in the surface civilization. Beyond the specific patterns to watch for, the reconstruction offers one final consideration for the listener who is trying to decide how seriously to take the framework. The consideration is this: the framework, if it is correct, describes a situation in which the surface civilization is a party to a very large-scale, very long-duration proceeding whose outcome has significant implications for the surface population's future. The framework, if it is incorrect, describes a fictional situation that has no real-world implications. In both cases, the framework can be evaluated on its internal coherence, on the quality of the source material it draws on, and on the plausibility of its interpretive claims. In only one of the two cases does the framework have practical consequences for what the listener does with their own time and attention, but the framework does not have to be certain in order for those practical consequences to be worth considering. A framework that has some probability of being correct, and whose correctness would have significant consequences, is a framework that deserves the kind of preparation that the warnings describe, even if the probability is not high, because the cost of the preparation, if the framework turns out to be incorrect, is relatively small. The listener has spent some hours listening to a recording, has thought about some material, has considered some interpretive claims, and has updated their overall view of the surface civilization's history and possible future. That is not a heavy cost. The cost of not preparing, if the framework turns out to be correct, is potentially very large, because it means facing the return without the preparation that the warnings say is necessary. And the asymmetry between the two costs is what makes the framework worth taking seriously, even in cases where the listener is not sure of its probability. This is not a rigorous argument for accepting the framework. It is only an argument for treating the framework as worth further attention rather than dismissing it after a single hearing. The listener who wants to make a rigorous decision about whether to accept the framework will need to do further work of their own. Consult the underlying tablet record where possible. Read the scholars who have worked on the reconstruction and the scholars who have worked in the mainstream tradition, and compare the arguments on both sides. Follow the patterns that the reconstruction anticipates and evaluate whether they are unfolding as expected. Talk with other people who have engaged with the framework and see whether their thinking illuminates aspects that had not been considered. Over time, and with sustained attention, the listener can form a considered judgment about the framework's overall credibility and about the appropriate level of preparation to undertake. That is what the recording can offer. Not a complete argument, not a definitive conclusion, only a careful presentation of the material, in the order that the reconstruction assigns to it, with the internal connections made visible and the practical implications laid out. What the listener does with the material from here is the listener's own responsibility. What the recording has done is discharge, in whatever small way, the ongoing obligation to keep the material available in a form that allows it to be considered on its merits. That obligation, according to the reconstruction, is one that each generation carries for the next. Enki carried it for Ziusudra. Ziusudra carried it for the survivors and their descendants. The various small lines across the intervening SARs carried it for their own successors. And whoever has been transmitting the elaborated reading of the flood tradition in the modern era has been carrying it for the current generation of listeners. This recording is a small addition to that long chain of transmission. Not a definitive statement, not a final word. Only one more careful iteration of the material, offered to whoever finds it useful, with the understanding that the transmission itself is what matters and that the eventual outcome depends on many transmissions across many generations doing their small parts. If nothing else, the listener will now have a somewhat clearer picture of what the reconstruction actually claims, in its most detailed form, about what Enki transmitted through the reed wall on the night before the flood at Shurupak. Whether the reconstruction is accurate, whether the transmission actually contained what the reconstruction says it contained, whether the whole framework is a correct reading of an actual event or a modern imposition on ambiguous ancient material, those questions remain open. But the listener now has the picture in a form clear enough to think about. And thinking about it, according to the reconstruction, is itself part of what the small line requires. The small line does not need everybody to agree. It needs a substantial number of people to have thought about the framework carefully enough that they can recognize the patterns as they unfold and respond in ways that are consistent with the warnings. Whether the listener becomes one of those people is a decision the listener will make in their own time and by their own criteria. This recording has done its part by presenting the material. The rest is up to whoever has been listening. And with that, the transmission of the 12 warnings, in the order Ziusudra received them, from the first to the final, is complete. One last observation before the recording closes. The name Ziusudra means, in the older Sumerian, life of long days. Not eternal life, not immortal life, not the kind of life that transcends ordinary human duration. Life of long days. A finite life, but longer than the ordinary. A life extended enough to carry the burden of the transmission across the threshold from the old world to the new. That is what Enki gave to Ziusudra, in addition to the boat and the warnings and the reed wall session. Time. Enough time to remember. Enough time to teach. Enough time to establish the small line on the other side of the water and to place it, however tentatively, on the trajectory that the 12 warnings were designed to protect. The gift of long days was not for Ziusudra alone. It was for what he carried, and what he carried is, in the end, what the listener is being asked to consider carrying, in whatever proportion the listener is willing and able. A share of the memory, a share of the framework, a share of the ongoing preparation. Not the whole thing. Nobody carries the whole thing, just a share. Enough to be counted, in the eventual accounting, as one of the parties who tried. That is what the 12 warnings, transmitted one more time, offer to whoever has listened all the way to the end. The transmission does not require you to accept. It only requires that the material remain available, in a form that can be considered on its merits, for as long as anyone will consider it. That, and nothing more, is what this recording has attempted to accomplish, from its opening to its close.